Hegemony or Survival: America's Quest for Global Dominance. Book by Noam Chomsky. Audiobook by the Learner's Library. Chapter 7. Cauldron of Animosities. Chapter 8. Terrorism and Justice: Some Useful Truisms. Chapter 9. A Passing Nightmare? Chapter 7. Cauldron of Animosities. Let us return to Michael Crapon's belief that the final days of 2002 might be the most dangerous time since the 1962 Cuban Missile Crisis. His primary concern was the unstable nuclear proliferation belt stretching from Pyongyang to Baghdad, including Iran, Iraq, North Korea, and the Indian subcontinent. Similar concerns, widely held, were heightened by Bush administration initiatives of 2002-3 that were seriously increasing international tensions and threats. There is a far more fearsome nuclear power nearby, rarely featured in public discussion in the U.S. because it is an appendage of U.S. power. That convention is not observed within the unstable belt itself, or even within the U.S. Strategic Command, STRATCOM, which is responsible for the nuclear arsenal. General Lee Butler, Commander-in-Chief of STRATCOM in 1992-94, observed that, "It is dangerous in the extreme that in the cauldron of animosities that we call the Middle East, one nation has armed itself, ostensibly, with stockpiles of nuclear weapons, perhaps numbering in the hundreds, and that inspires other nations to do so." Israel's WMD are of concern to the world's second leading nuclear power as well. Similar concerns were expressed, more obliquely, in Security Council Resolution 687, which was selectively invoked by the Bush and Blair administrations in their efforts to provide a quasi-legal basis for their invasion of Iraq. Neither that nor any other resolution grants such authorization, but 687 did call for elimination of Iraqi WMD and delivery systems, as a step toward the goal of establishing in the Middle East a zone free from weapons of mass destruction and all missiles for their delivery. Article 14. U.S. intelligence and other sources assume that Israel has several hundred nuclear weapons and has been developing chemical and biological weapons. Article 14 is commonly ignored in U.S. commentary, but not elsewhere. Iraq, for example, called on the Security Council to apply Article 14. Its motives do not obviate the importance of the issue. General Butler's concerns are not trivial. Undoubtedly, Israeli military power will continue to inspire other nations to develop WMD, including quite possibly even Iraq, if it is granted a modicum of independence. The issue addressed by Article 14 had arisen before, on the eve of the First Gulf War. After invading Kuwait in August 1990, Iraq made a number of proposals for withdrawal within the context of a broader regional settlement. These were leaked to the press by U.S. government officials who found them as serious and negotiable. How serious they were we cannot judge. The U.S. immediately dismissed them, according to the only journalist in the country who reported the matter carefully, Knut Royce of Newsday. It is of some interest that in the final polls before the bombing, 2/3 of the American public favored a conference on the Israel-Arab conflict if it would lead to Iraqi withdrawal. Doubtless those figures would have been higher if the public had known that Iraq had just made a similar proposal, dismissed by Washington. A devastating war and even more destructive aftermath might have been prevented, hundreds of thousands of lives saved, and perhaps a basis laid for the overthrow of Saddam's tyranny. It is possible that steps might have been taken toward elimination of WMD and delivery systems in the region and beyond, perhaps even extending to the great powers. for 30 years in violation of their commitment under the Nuclear Non-Proliferation Treaty to take good faith steps toward eliminating nuclear weapons, matters of no slight significance. Well beyond WMD, Israel's military capacities are regarded in the region as dangerous in the extreme. Though a very small country, Israel has chosen to become, in effect, an offshore U.S. military and technology base, and as such has been able to develop highly advanced military forces. The core of the economy is a military-linked high-tech industrial system, with close ties to the U.S. economy. Not surprisingly, Israel is coming to resemble its patron in other ways as well. A parliamentary, Knesset, investigation found that Israel is now rated second in the Western world, after the United States, in terms of social gaps in income, property, capital, education, and spending, as well as in the extent of poverty. Its formerly quite successful social welfare system has eroded, and social-cultural values have changed significantly as well. Like its patron, Israel has military forces that are off the spectrum of societies comparable in other dimensions. The head of research and development for the Israel Defense Forces, IDF, described its air and armored forces as larger and technologically more advanced than those of any NATO power apart from the US. Its conventional military forces are used to attack its neighbors and to control and subjugate the population in the territories it occupies, in ways not easily overlooked in the region or by people elsewhere who are concerned with human rights. Israel also has a close military alliance with the other major regional military power, Turkey. The U.S.-Turkey-Israel alliance is sometimes called the Axis of Evil in the Middle East. The term is understandable. There is always plenty of evil to go around, and this axis at least has the merit of existing, unlike the one concocted by George Bush's speechwriters, which consists of two states that had been at war for 20 years and a third that was presumably thrown in because it is non-Muslim, and universally reviled. U.S. academic specialist Robert Olson reports that 12% of Israel's offensive aircraft are to be permanently stationed in Turkey, and have been flying reconnaissance flights along Iran's border, signaling to Iran that it would soon be challenged elsewhere by Turkey and its Israeli and American allies. He suggests that these operations are part of a long-term effort to undermine and perhaps partition Iran, separating its northern Azeri regions, rather as Russia attempted to do in 1946. One of the early Cold War crises, thus turning the country into an anemic geopolitical entity, barred from access to the Caspian Sea and Central Asia generally. Olson also discusses one of the usual background concerns, to expedite development of oil pipelines from the Caspian region to Turkey and the Mediterranean, cutting out Iran. The U.S.-Turkey alliance might undergo some changes if the U.S. is able to shift military bases from eastern Turkey to Iraq, right in the heart of the world's richest energy reserves. U.S. anger over Turkey's democratic deviation in 2002-3 could weaken U.S.-Turkey military and intergovernmental relations, but that seems doubtful. The existing tripartite alliance extends to parts of Central Asia and recently to India as well. Since its government came under the control of the Hindu right in 1998, India has shifted its international stance considerably, moving toward a closer military relationship with both the U.S. and its Israeli client. Indian political analyst Praful Bidwai writes that the ruling Hindu nationalist fascination with Zionism is rooted in Islamophobia, and anti-Arabism, and hypernationalism. Its ideology is Sharon's machismo and ferocious jingoism. It sees Hindus and Jews, plus Christians, as forming a strategic alliance against Islam and Confucianism. Addressing the American Jewish Committee in Washington, India's National Security Advisor, Brajesh Mishra, called for development of a U.S. Israel-India triad that will have the political will and moral authority to take bold decisions in combating terror. According to Bidvai, the growing Indo-Israel political military contacts are supplemented by coordination of the influential Hindu nationalist and Israeli lobbies in the U.S. India and Israel are both significant military powers, with nuclear weapons and delivery systems, and the emerging alliance system is another factor contributing to WMD proliferation, terror, and disorder in the unstable belt and beyond. U.S.-Israel relations, origins and maturation. It does not take much insight into world affairs to predict that the cauldron of animosities in the Middle East will continue to boil. Internal conflicts have been exacerbated as the industrial world shifted toward an oil-based economy from World War I, and the incomparable petroleum resources of the Middle East were discovered. After World War II, a high priority of U.S. policy was to ensure its control over a region of such great material wealth and strategic significance. In its day in the sun, Britain had controlled the region by delegating authority to clients, with British force in the background. In the terminology of the Foreign Office, local management was to be left to an Arab facade of weak compliant rulers, while Britain's absorption of these virtual colonies would be veiled by constitutional fictions, a device considered more cost-effective than direct rule. With variations, the device is familiar elsewhere. The population did not passively submit. Fortunately for imperial planners, air power was becoming available to control civilian populations, though some, like Winston Churchill, were enamored of the possibilities of using poison gas to subdue recalcitrant Arabs, mainly Kurds and Afghans. In the interwar years, there were attempts to ban or limit war, but Britain made sure these would not interfere with imperial rule, setting a precedent for its successor in world control. Specifically, Britain undermined attempts to restrict the use of air power against civilians. The reasons were expressed succinctly by the distinguished statesman Lloyd George, who praised the British government for reserving the right to bomb niggers. Fundamental moral principles tend to have a long life. This one is no exception. The U.S. took over the British framework but added another layer of control, peripheral states, preferably non-Arab, that could serve as local cops on the beat, in the terminology of the Nixon administration. Police headquarters would, of course, remain in Washington, with a branch office in London. Turkey was a leading member of the club from the outset, joined by Iran in 1953, when a US-UK military coup restored the Shah, overthrowing a conservative parliamentary government that was seeking to control its own resources. The U.S. has been concerned more with control than access. After World War II, North America was the world's major oil producer, though this position was not expected to last long. Later, a major exporter to the U.S. was Venezuela. Current projections of U.S. intelligence are that the U.S. will continue to rely primarily on Atlantic Basin resources, those in the Western Hemisphere and West Africa, which are more stable and reliable than those of the Middle East. But as throughout the post-war period, that does not remove the perceived need to retain control. Control over the great material prize of the Gulf ensures that US-UK energy corporations will be the main beneficiaries of enormous profits. The wealth recycles to the US and British economies in many other ways as well, including military hardware, hence high-tech industry generally, construction projects, and treasury securities. The recognized, stupendous strategic power of the region translates into a lever of world domination. All of this was understood clearly by those who planned the post-war world, and retains its force. U.S. intelligence expects Gulf energy resources to become even more significant in the years ahead, hence also the drive to maintain control, whether the U.S. itself relies heavily on these resources or not. The global system of military bases from the Pacific to the Azores was designed in considerable measure for operations in the Gulf region. U.S. counterinsurgency and subversion in Greece and Italy in the 1940s were in part motivated by concern over the free flow of Middle East oil to the West. By now the basing system extends to the former Soviet satellites Bulgaria and Romania. Since the Carter years, the major U.S. intervention forces have been aimed at the Gulf. Until recently, the only fully reliable military base nearby was the British-held island of Diego Garcia, from which the inhabitants were expelled. The U.S. still refuses them the right of return, overruling decisions of the British courts. The issue is unknown in the U.S., much like the case of Okinawa. The Afghan War left the U.S. with military bases in Afghanistan and Central Asia, helping to position U.S. corporations more favorably in the current phase of the Great Game, to control Central Asian resources, and also to extend the encirclement of the far more important Persian Gulf. It had long been anticipated that one of Washington's goals in Iraq was to obtain military bases right in the heart of the oil-producing regions, as reported at the war's end. Other likely goals also moved into the public domain at the war's end. The two things that were never openly discussed, that never became part of the national conversation, were oil and money. Bob Herbert commented, "Those crucial topics were left to the major behind-the-scenes operators, many of whom are now cashing in." U.S. relations with Israel largely developed within this general context. In 1948, the Joint Chiefs of Staff were impressed with Israel's military prowess, describing Israel as second only to Turkey in military power in the region. They suggested that Israel might offer the U.S. means to gain strategic advantage in the Middle East, to offset Britain's declining role. 10 years later, these considerations gained some concrete significance. The year 1958 was highly significant in world affairs. The Eisenhower administration identified three major crises: Indonesia, North Africa, and the Middle East. All involved oil producers and Islamic political forces, which were then secular. Eisenhower and Secretary of State Dulles stressed that there was no Russian involvement in any of these crises. The problem was the familiar devil, radical nationalism. In North Africa, the concern was the Algerian struggle for independence, which the U.S. wanted quickly settled. In Indonesia, the culprit was Sukarno, who was one of the leaders of the despised non-aligned movement and was also allowing too much democracy. A popular-based party of poor peasants was gaining influence. In the Middle East, the villain was Nasser, described as a new Hitler by panicked U.S. and British leaders. He too was a pillar of the non-aligned movement, and his influence, it was feared, might tempt others to pursue an independent course. Those fears appeared to be realized in 1958 when a coup in Iraq, assumed to be Nasserite in origin, overthrew the British-backed government. Consequences reverberate to the present. The Iraqi coup led to intense US-UK discussions. Policymakers were concerned that Kuwait might seek independence and that even Saudi Arabia might succumb to the disease. The British economy was heavily reliant on profits from Kuwaiti oil production and investment. Britain decided to grant Kuwait nominal independence, though we must also accept the need, if things go wrong, ruthlessly to intervene, whoever it is has caused the trouble, Foreign Secretary Selwyn Lloyd explained. The U.S. adopted the same stand on forceful intervention with regard to the bigger prizes, Saudi Arabia and the other Gulf Emirates. Eisenhower sent military forces to Lebanon to block a perceived nationalist threat there and to ensure control over pipelines. He reiterated his concern over the most strategically important area of the world, and emphasized that loss of control would be far worse than the loss of China, regarded as the worst post-war catastrophe, because of the strategic position and resources of the Middle East. Another country of critical importance that might, it was feared, fall under Nasserite influence was Jordan, then the regional base for British military power. Israel assisted in assuring British control. Washington planners recognized that Israel was the only regional power that had taken risks for the sake of relieving the situation in the area. A memorandum for the National Security Council advised that, if we choose to combat radical Arab nationalism and to hold Persian Gulf oil by force if necessary, a logical corollary would be to support Israel as the only strong pro-West power left in the Near East, along with the peripheral powers, Turkey and Iran. At the same time, in 1958, Israel-Turkey relations were established with a visit to Turkey by Prime Minister David Ben-Gurion. By 2000, Ephraim Inbar writes, Israel's relations to Turkey were second only to the closeness of Israel-US ties. In 1967, the US-Israeli alliance was firmly in place. Israel destroyed Nasser, thus protecting the facade in the Arabian Peninsula and also striking a powerful blow against the non-aligned movement. That was considered a major contribution to U.S. power. There was also a significant effect within the U.S. ideological domain, an important topic that I will have to put aside. Recall the three major crises of 1958. The threat of independent Arab nationalism in the Middle East was overcome by the 1967 war. The North African crisis ended with Algerian independence. The crisis in Indonesia was resolved by a huge massacre, mainly of landless peasants, which the CIA described as one of the great mass murders of the 20th century, comparable to those of Hitler, Stalin, and Mao. This staggering mass slaughter, as the New York Times called it, was greeted with unrestrained euphoria in the West. It eliminated the mass-based political party of the poor and opened the doors wide to Western investors. As in the Middle East, another pillar of the non-aligned movement was demolished. Somewhat similar processes were underway in Latin America and, to a more limited extent, in India, the last major stronghold of non-alignment. Throughout, the U.S. role was significant, sometimes crucially so. The U.S. is a global power, like England before it. It is often misleading to focus on one region of the world, forgetting that global planning is in Washington. Keeping nevertheless to the Middle East, in 1970 Israel performed another service by deterring possible Syrian intervention to protect Palestinians who were being massacred in Jordan. U.S. aid to Israel quadrupled. U.S. intelligence, along with such influential figures concerned with the Middle East as Senator Henry Jackson, described the tacit alliance of Israel-Iran-Saudi Arabia as a solid basis for U.S. power in the region, with Turkey taken for granted. In 1979 the Shah fell and the Israel-Turkey alliance became even more important as a regional base. The alliance welcomed a new member, replacing the Shah, Saddam Hussein's Iraq, which the Reagan administration removed from the official list of terrorist states in 1982, so that the U.S. could freely provide the tyrant with aid. Israel's choices over the past 30 years have reduced its options considerably. On its present course, it has virtually no alternative to serving as a U.S. base in the region and complying with U.S. demands. The options were starkly illuminated in 1971, when President Anwar Sadat of Egypt offered Israel a full peace treaty in return for Israeli withdrawal from Egyptian territory. Sadat offered nothing to the Palestinians and omitted reference to the other occupied territories. In his memoirs, Yitzhak Rabin, then ambassador to the U.S., refers to the famous offer as a milestone on the path to peace, though it contained a bad news as well: the condition that Israel withdraw from Egyptian territory, in accord with official U.S. policy and the basic diplomatic document, Security Council Resolution 242 of November 1967. Israel had a fateful choice: it could accept peace and integration into the region or insist on confrontation, hence inevitable dependency on the U.S. It chose the latter course, not on grounds of security but because of a commitment to expansion. That is clear in Israeli sources. General Chaim Bar-Lev, a leading figure in the governing Labour Party, expressed the common understanding when he wrote in a Labour Party journal that, "We can have peace, but I think if we continue to hold out we can obtain more." The more that was of primary interest at the time was the northeastern Sinai, from which the inhabitants were brutally expelled into the desert to make way for the establishment of the all-Jewish city of Yamit. In 1972, General Ezer Weizman, later president, added that a political settlement without expansion would mean that Israel could not exist according to the scale, spirit, and quality she now embodies. The crucial question was how Washington would react. After internal debate, the government abandoned its official policy in favor of Kissinger's principle of stalemate: no diplomacy, only force. It should be recalled that this was a period of extreme triumphalism, later greatly regretted in Israel. The U.S. and Israel took it for granted after 1967 that Arabs could pose no military threat. The Egyptian peace offer is not famous in the U.S., rather, unknown, a common fate of events that do not conform to doctrinal requirements. Sadat still hoped to gain U.S. acquiescence by expelling his Russian advisors and other moves. He also warned that Yamit means war. He was not taken seriously. In 1973 he did launch a war, which was a near disaster for Israel and also led to a nuclear alert in the U.S. At that point, Kissinger realized that Egypt could not simply be dismissed, and launched his shuttle diplomacy, which led finally to the Camp David settlement of 1978–79. At Camp David the U.S. and Israel accepted Sadat's 1971 offer, but on terms much less favorable from their point of view. By then the fate of the Palestinians had become an issue, and Sadat joined most of the rest of the world in insisting on their rights. These events are hailed as a U.S. diplomatic triumph. Jimmy Carter won the Nobel Peace Prize primarily for the culminating achievement. The entire process was, in reality, a diplomatic catastrophe. The U.S.-Israel rejection of diplomacy led to a terrible war, great suffering, and a superpower confrontation that could have gotten out of hand. But one of the prerogatives of power is the ability to write history with confidence that there will be little challenge. The disaster therefore enters history as a grand triumph of the U.S.-run peace process. Israel recognized at once that with the Arab deterrent removed, it could intensify its expansion into the occupied territories and attack its northern neighbor, as it proceeded to do in 1978 and 1982, continuing to occupy parts of Lebanon for almost 20 years. The 1982 invasion and its immediate aftermath left some 20,000 dead, according to Lebanese sources. The toll in the following years was about 25,000. The topic is of little concern in the West, on the principle that crimes for which we are responsible require no inquiry. let alone punishment or reparations. After many bombings and other provocations failed to elicit a pretext for the planned 1982 invasion, Israel finally seized upon the attempted assassination of its ambassador in London by the terrorist group headed by Abu Nidal, who had been condemned to death by the PLO and had been at war with it for years. Resort to this pretext was acceptable to articulate American opinion, which also had no problem with Israel's immediate response, an attack on the Sabra Shatila Palestinian refugee camps in Beirut, where 200 people were killed, according to a reliable American observer. UN attempts to halt the aggression were blocked by immediate U.S. vetoes. So matters continued through 18 bloody years of Israeli atrocities in Lebanon, rarely with even a thin pretext of self-defense. Chief of Staff Raphael Eitan echoed the common understanding in Israel when he at once declared the 1982 invasion to be a success, because it weakened the political status of the PLO and set back its struggle for a Palestinian state. Leading U.S. intellectuals also welcomed the political defeat of the PLO, clearly recognizing that to be the goal of the war while anointing it a just war. Michael Walzer. Most public commentary and media, however, preferred tales about unprovoked rocket attacks on innocent Israelis and similar fabrications, though by now the truth is sometimes recognized. New York Times correspondent James Bennett writes that the goal of the 1982 invasion was to install a friendly regime and destroy Mr. Arafat's Palestinian Liberation Organization. That, the theory went, would help persuade Palestinians to accept Israeli rule in the West Bank and Gaza Strip. To my knowledge, this is the first report in the American mainstream of what was well known in Israel, and has been published in marginalized dissident circles in the U.S. for 20 years. It is also a textbook illustration of massive international terrorism, if not the more severe crime of aggression, tracing right back to Washington, which provided the requisite economic, military, and diplomatic support. Without such authorization and aid, Israel can do very little. There are many illusions about this in the Arab countries and elsewhere. Particularly for the victims, it is not wise to live with illusions. On the diplomatic front, by the mid-1970s U.S.-Israeli isolation increased as the Palestinian issue entered the international agenda. In 1976 the U.S. vetoed a resolution calling for a Palestinian state alongside Israel, incorporating the basic wording of UN Resolution 242 from 1967. From then to the present the U.S. has blocked the possibility of a diplomatic settlement in the terms, accepted by virtually the entire world, a two-state settlement on the international border, with minor and mutual adjustments. That was the principle of official, though not actual, U.S. policy until the Clinton administration formally abandoned the framework of international diplomacy, declaring UN resolutions obsolete and anachronistic. It is noteworthy that the U.S. stand is also opposed by most of the U.S. population. A large majority support the Saudi plan, proposed in early 2002 and accepted by the Arab League, which offered full recognition and integration of Israel into the region in exchange for withdrawal to the 1967 borders. Yet another version of the long-standing international consensus that the U.S. has blocked. Large majorities also believe that the U.S. should equalize aid to Israel and the Palestinians under a negotiated settlement, and should cut aid to either party that refuses to negotiate, meaning, at the time of the poll, that it should cut aid to Israel. But few understand what any of this implies, and almost nothing is reported about it. After the First Gulf War, Washington felt that it was in a position to impose its own preferred solution. Although never fully elaborated, The 1991 version was to be more forthcoming than the administration position announced in December 1989, which endorsed without qualifications the Israeli coalition government, Shamir Peres, plan stipulating that there can be no additional Palestinian state, Jordan already being a Palestinian state in their conception, and that the fate of the territories will be determined in accordance with the basic guidelines of the Israeli government. Washington convened the Madrid Conference, with Russian participation to offer a fig leaf of internationalism. But a problem arose at the conference. The Palestinian delegation was headed by Haider Abd al-Shafi, a conservative nationalist known for his integrity and one of the most respected Palestinian figures. The delegation refused to agree to continued Israeli settlement programs in the occupied territories, thus deadlocking the negotiations, because the US and Israel refused to agree to this condition, even to consider it seriously. Recognizing that his public support was collapsing within the territories and the Palestinian diaspora, Yasser Arafat undercut the Palestinian delegation by secret negotiations with Israel, leading to the Oslo process, initiated officially with much pomp in September 1993 at the White House. The wording of the Oslo agreements made it clear that they were a mandate for continued Israeli settlement programs, as the Israeli leadership, Yitzhak Rabin and Shimon Peres, took no pains to conceal. For that reason, Abd al-Shafi refused to have anything to do with the official peace process. So matters proceeded through the 1990s, as Israeli settlement and integration of the territories proceeded steadily, with full U.S. support. In 2000, the final year of Clinton's term, and Israeli Prime Minister Ehud Barak's settlement reached its highest peak since 1992. Striking further blows at the possibility of a resolution of the conflict by peaceful diplomatic means. Camp David II and beyond, toward a permanent neocolonial dependency. U.S.-Israeli rejectionism runs through the Camp David negotiations of 2000. The conventional image is that Clinton and Barak made a magnanimous offer of unparalleled generosity, but the treacherous Palestinians turned it down, preferring violence. There is a simple way to evaluate these claims: present a map of the territorial settlement proposed. No map has been found in U.S. media or journals, apart from scholarly sources and the dissident literature. A look at the maps reveals that the Clinton-Barak offer virtually divided the West Bank into 3 cantons, effectively separated from one another by 2 salients consisting of expansive Jewish settlement and infrastructure developments. The 3 cantons have only limited access to East Jerusalem, the center of Palestinian commercial, cultural, and political life. And all are separated from Gaza. Admittedly, this would have been an improvement over the status quo, with Palestinians in the West Bank confined to more than 200 cantons, some a few square kilometers, and the situation in the Gaza Strip was in many ways worse. Shortly before joining the Barak government and becoming the chief negotiator at Camp David, Shlomo Ben-Ami, considered a dove in the Israeli spectrum, published an academic study in which he outlined the goal of the Oslo peace process: to establish a neo-colonial dependency for the Palestinians, which will be permanent. That is essentially what was offered at Camp David. In Israel, maps did appear in the mainstream press, and the proposals are commonly described as modeled on South Africa's Bantustans of 40 years ago. Respected commentators report that the South African model was considered very seriously in high military and political echelons in the 1970s and 1980s, and is the model today. Israel also considered South Africa a valued ally, as did the U.S., through the Reagan years. After the failure of Camp David 2000, negotiations continued. They led to high-level, but unofficial, meetings at Taba, Egypt, in January 2001. These appeared to be making considerable progress, though the major territorial problems remained, in less extreme forms. There is a careful record of the Taba negotiations in a report by the European Union observer Miguel Moratinos, approved by both sides. The basic differences were narrowed but not entirely bridged. For the West Bank, there was agreement in principle on the long-standing international consensus honoring the internationally recognized border, with minor and mutual adjustments, now not so minor because of the U.S.-backed Israeli settlement and infrastructure programs that, as noted, rapidly expanded as the Oslo process proceeded on its largely predictable course. Palestinian negotiators at Taba agreed to include within Israel the post-Oslo settlements, established around the vastly expanded Jerusalem, but called for a one-to-one territorial swap, with the support of some Israeli hawks, who welcomed the opportunity to transfer Israeli Arabs out of the country, thus relieving the much-feared demographic problem, too many non-Jews in a Jewish state. But the Israeli negotiators insisted on a 2-to-1, or larger, swap in their favor, with Palestinians offered a worthless area adjacent to the Sinai Desert. The primary territorial issue remained the status of the Israeli town of Ma'ale Adumim to the east of Jerusalem, and the infrastructure linking it to the expanded areas to be annexed to Israel, developed mostly in the 1990s with the clear intent of virtually bisecting the West Bank. These issues remained unresolved, along with some others, but there is good reason to accept Akiva Eldar's conclusion that progress was real and promising, even if not formal. The negotiations were called off by Barak prior to the Israeli elections, and in the face of escalating violence were never resumed, so we cannot know where they might have led. The basic issues were reviewed by Hussein Agha and Robert Malley, two well-informed commentators in foreign affairs. They observed, accurately, that the outlines of a solution have basically been understood for some time now: a territorial divide on the international border, with a one-to-one land swap. They write that the way to get to the solution has eluded all sides from the start, but while accurate, the statement is misleading. The way has been blocked for 25 years by the United States, and Israel continues to reject it even at the dovish extreme of the mainstream political spectrum, as the Moratinos report again documents. During the Bush II Sharon years, the prospects for a diplomatic solution have declined further. Israel has expanded its settlement programs, with continued U.S. backing. The Israeli human rights organization B'Tselem was finally able to obtain official maps indicating Israeli territorial intentions. Israeli settlements now control 42% of the West Bank. The boundaries of Ma'ale Adumim, for example, reach from the area of Greater Jerusalem almost to the isolated Palestinian town of Jericho, a salient that largely isolates the southern region of the West Bank. Another salient to the north also remains, partially separating the northern from the central sectors. The result is a harsh version of the three-canton arrangement for the West Bank, all virtually separated from a small part of East Jerusalem, and of course from Gaza, however its fate is determined. The situation in 2003 is described in the primary U.S. scholarly source on the settlements by its editor, Jeffrey Aronson, after a visit to the southern area. In virtually every Israeli settlement, colonization efforts are proceeding apace, leading to revolutionary changes in patterns of transportation and access aimed at consolidating Israel's ability to secure a permanent hold over these lands, integrated within the much-expanded Israel. In contrast, the dynamic for Palestinians is just the opposite. an ever-increasing network of barricades, obstacles, patrol roads, and prohibitions that isolate them from settlements, from each other, and from places of work, compromising their ability to lead normal lives and impoverishing an entire national community. As for Bush administration plans in mid-2003, there are two sources: rhetoric and action. At the rhetorical level, one reads of Bush's vision of a Palestinian state, and the U.S.-inspired a roadmap. In the real world, the Bush administration repeatedly blocked public release of the roadmap of the Quartet, EU, UN, Russia, US, much to the annoyance of the other members. The vision was left vague, and remained so after the roadmap was finally released, accompanied by Bush's modest announcement that the roadmap represents a starting point toward achieving the vision of two states that I set out in June 24, 2002, namely, a pale and indistinct version of the vision that had been common coin for over a quarter century, but blocked by the U.S. The first steps on the roadmap are explicit: Palestinians must immediately terminate resistance to the occupation, including attacks on Israeli soldiers in the occupied territories, and Israel must declare its commitment to the two-state vision, expressed by President Bush, its nature unclear. As comprehensive security performance moves forward, IDF withdraws progressively from areas occupied since September 28, 2000, and the two sides restore the status quo that existed at that time. Satisfactory performance will be determined by Israel and Washington. The status quo that is to be restored leaves Palestinians confined to hundreds of cantons, surrounded by the settlements and infrastructure constructed by the U.S.-backed Israeli military occupation. The future of these settlements remains unclear. Israel immediately dismantles settlement outposts erected since March 2001, something on which all but the ultra-right in Israel agree, and at some time left unspecified. Israel freezes all settlement activity, including natural growth of settlements. Until that time, the settlements can continue to expand. If the time for freezing ever comes, the Bantustan-style arrangements instituted through the 1990s in the context of the U.S.-Israel peace process, continued under the roadmap, will presumably be well established. Later still there is to be implementation of prior agreements, to enhance maximum territorial contiguity for the Palestinian state, including further action on settlements. The further action remains unspecified. There are no prior agreements that yield meaningful territorial contiguity. The only serious proposals that have been made are not on the agenda. Whatever Bush's two-state vision may be, it is apparently not the two-state vision supported by virtually the entire world that the U.S. has blocked since the mid-1970s, nor the Saudi plan ratified by the Arab League and supported by a majority of the American population, nor the solution whose outlines have basically been understood for some time now, described by Aga and Mali. There is no hint of any of these ideas. Furthermore, although there is immediate and violent enforcement of the roadmap's conditions on the Palestinians, there is no enforcement of conditions on the U.S.-funded Israeli settlement and development programs. There is a rich record about all of this, and no reason to expect any significant change. Though the political roadmap remains vague with regard to Israel's responsibilities, other demands are quite specific. The huge U.S. subsidy to Israel is, for the first time, conditioned on Israel's performance, not on its implementation of the terms of the roadmap, but on an economic plan that will slash public sector jobs and wages and lower taxes, measures that have been dubbed an economic roadmap. The plan is described by Israel's leading newspaper as a new theory according to which the U.S. openly intervenes in forcing a neoliberal order in Israel, a theory that is welcome to the Israeli business sector but led immediately to a strike of 700,000 workers. Also quite specific are operations to create facts on the ground, while talk proceeds, in the traditional manner. Notable among them is the construction of the separation wall that incorporates parts of the West Bank within Israel. The justification offered for the barrier is security, for Israelis, not Palestinians, whose security problems are far more grave. A barrier with a land swap would provide no less security. The most security would be given by a wall a few miles inside Israel, to allow the IDF to patrol fully on both sides. But such proposals would not incorporate Palestinian land within Israel, and would disrupt the lives of Israelis rather than Palestinians, and are therefore unthinkable. World Bank-sponsored reports conclude that the wall will leave almost 100,000 Palestinians on the Israeli side, along with some of the richest agricultural land in the West Bank. The wall also places a good part of the vitally important West Bank aquifer under Israeli control. One West Bank town, Kalkia, is already virtually surrounded by the wall, cut off from its lands, 30% of its water supplies, and whatever territories will be assigned someday to the viable Palestinian state with territorial contiguity. More than half of Kalkilia's agricultural lands were reported to have been confiscated, to be annexed to Israel, with the munificent offer of one-time compensation equal to the market price of 1 year's harvest. Immediately after Colin Powell went to Israel to meet with Prime Minister Sharon and discuss the road map, Sharon informed the press that as the wall proceeded south of Kalkia, it would sweep well to the east to enclose the Israeli settlements of Ariel and Emmanuel, thereby partially separating the northern Palestinian enclave from the central one by a salient of Israeli settlements and infrastructure, as in the Clinton-Barak Camp David plan. There can be little doubt that the second and more important of the Clinton-Barak extensions of Israeli territory, dividing the central enclave from the southern one, will also be incorporated, de facto, within Israel, in some manner. There is also little reason to doubt that Israeli communities that remain outside the wall will retain their current status as, effectively, parts of Israel, linked to it by large-scale infrastructure, protected by the IDF, and free to expand within their allotted territory until some order to the contrary comes from above. The very well-informed Harvard University scholar Sarah Roy, relying on internal sources, writes that the World Bank estimates that some 232,000 people living in 72 communities will be affected by the first, northern phase of the wall's construction, with 140,000 living on the eastern side of the wall but, in effect, encircled within its winding path, and that completion could isolate as many as 250,000 to 300,000 Palestinians while annexing as much as 10% of the West Bank to Israel. She suggests further that the wall's design may be aimed at carving out and encircling the 42%, or less, of the West Bank that Sharon has said he is prepared to cede to a Palestinian state. If so, Sharon may have in mind something like the plan he proposed in 1992, now recognizing that the political spectrum has shifted so far toward the extremist nationalist pole that what seemed audacious then may be portrayed as a dramatic concession today. The facts on the ground, Israeli journalist Amira Hass comments, are determining, and will continue to determine, the area where the road map will be applied, the area where the entity known as the Palestinian state will be established. A visit to the places where the Public Works Commission, the Defense Ministry, Housing Ministry, and the IDF bulldozers are busy at work makes it possible to see why it's easy for Prime Minister Ariel Sharon to talk about a Palestinian state. The massive construction in Jerusalem and its environs, from Bethlehem to Ramallah, and the Dead Sea to Modi'in, has already ruled out any Palestinian urban, industrial or cultural development worthy of the name in the area of East Jerusalem. The southern enclave of the West Bank, from Hebron to Bethlehem, will be cut off from the central enclave of the Ramallah area by an ocean of manicured Israeli settlements, tunnel roads and highways. The northern enclave, from Jenin to Nablus, will be cut off from the center by the massive settlement block of Ariel Shiloh. As for the settlement freeze, when Sharon persuaded his extremist cabinet to accept the road map, he explained that, "There is no restriction here, and you can build for your children and grandchildren, and I hope for your great-grandchildren as well." At the rhetorical level, the road map appears to offer more to the Palestinians than the Oslo process. It uses such terms as Palestinian state, end to the occupation, freeze on all settlement activity, etc., all phrases missing from the Oslo protocols. But the appearance is deceptive. Apart from extremist elements, Israel and its sponsor have no intention of taking over territories beyond useful and desirable limits or of having Israel administer the bulk of the Palestinian population. Construction of facts on the ground has proceeded sufficiently to allow the free use of terms that might previously have impeded plans that have been implemented for the past decade and are now being established more firmly. Apart from the rhetoric about visions, there is a more significant source of information: actions. Keeping just to a few illustrations, in December 2000 the Bush administration caused some consternation abroad when it vetoed a Security Council resolution, advanced by the European Union, calling for implementation of Washington's Mitchell Plan and efforts to reduce violence by the dispatch of international monitors, to which Israel strongly objects. Their presence is likely to reduce Palestinian violence but would also impede Israeli repression and terror. 10 days before the veto, Washington boycotted a conference in Geneva of the high contracting parties of the Geneva Conventions, called to review the situation in the occupied territories. The boycott yielded the usual double veto: the decisions are blocked, and the events are barely reported and erased from history. The conference reaffirmed the applicability of the Fourth Geneva Convention to the occupied territories, so that many U.S.-Israeli actions there are war crimes under U.S. law. The conference again condemned U.S.-funded Israeli settlements and the practice of willful killing, torture, unlawful deportation, willful depriving of the rights of fair and regular trial, extensive destruction and appropriation of property, carried out unlawfully and wantonly. The Fourth Geneva Convention, instituted to criminalize formally the crimes of the Nazis in occupied Europe, is a core principle of international humanitarian law. Its applicability to the Israeli-occupied territories has repeatedly been affirmed, among other occasions, by UN Ambassador George Bush, September 1971, and by Security Council resolutions. These include Resolution 465, 1980, adopted unanimously, which condemned U.S.-backed Israeli practices as flagrant violations of the Convention, and Resolution 1322, October 2000, 14-0, U.S. abstaining, which called on Israel to abide scrupulously by its responsibilities under the Fourth Geneva Convention. As high contracting parties, the U.S. and the European powers are obligated by solemn treaty to apprehend and prosecute those responsible for such crimes, including their own leadership. By continuing to reject that duty, they are enhancing terror, to borrow Bush IP's words condemning Palestinians. The U.S. stance has shifted over the years from endorsement of the applicability of the conventions to the occupied territories, to abstention during the Clinton years, and finally to undermining them under Bush II. The Bush administration signaled its tacit endorsement of violent repression in the occupied territories in other ways as well. Thus, while Ariel Sharon was conducting his brutal offensive in the West Bank in April 2002, Colin Powell was sent to bring peace. He meandered through the Mediterranean, arriving in Israel just as the defenders of Jenin were running out of food and ammunition. One may presume that State Department intelligence was able to work out that calculation. A Pentagon official stated the obvious: Powell's itinerary, he said, was designed to give Sharon some more time. A State Department official added that the Israelis are not listening so much to what we say, but are watching what we do. And what we're doing is giving them more time to withdraw. When they finished their work, leveling the refugee camp at Jenin, smashing much of the old city of Nablus, and destroying the institutional and cultural infrastructure of Palestinian life in Ramallah with the viciousness that has been IDF practice for many years. In December 2002, the UN General Assembly reiterated the near-universal opposition to Israel's effective annexation of Jerusalem, in defiance of Security Council resolutions going back to 1968, passed with U.S. support. For the first time, the U.S. voted against the resolution, formally reversing the long-standing official U.S. position on the status of Jerusalem. The U.S. was joined by Israel, several Pacific Island dependencies, and Costa Rica. If intended seriously, this reversal virtually eliminates the possibility of a political settlement. The Bush administration also continued to sustain violence by voting against a resolution calling for international efforts to halt the deteriorating situation between Israel and the Palestinians, reverse all measures taken on the ground since the latest. Violence began in September 2000, and push for a peace agreement, past 164, the U.S. joined by Israel, Micronesia, and the Marshall Islands. Following the conventional pattern, none of this seems to have been reported in the U.S. Bush also declared the arch-terrorist Sharon a man of peace, and demanded that Arafat be replaced by a prime minister who will meet U.S.-Israeli demands, though, unlike Mr. Arafat, he does not have a popular following. All of this provides further illustration of the president's vision of democracy. In February 2003, Bush delivered what the New York Times called his first significant remarks about the Israeli-Palestinian conflict in 8 months, in a speech to the far-right American Enterprise Institute. The speech was mostly vacuous, but it did indeed contain one significant remark. Bush declared obliquely that Israel could continue its programs of settlement and development in the occupied territories. The form of his endorsement was the statement that, as progress is made toward peace, settlement activity in the occupied territories must end, implying that it can continue until the U.S. determines, unilaterally, as always, that progress has been made. Again, Bush's sole, significant remark reverses official government policy. Previously, the settlement programs had been considered illegal, or at least unhelpful. Now they are implicitly authorized. In defense of the administration, one may argue that official doctrine has been brought into conformity with near-invariant practice. Prevailing values are often expressed implicitly, as on the first anniversary of 9/11, when the president took the occasion to provide $200 million in supplemental funding for the rich country of Israel while rejecting $130 million for emergency supplemental aid to Afghanistan, and not only in the U.S. Thus former UK Foreign Secretary Douglas Lord Hurd wrote that two unsolved problems torment the Middle East: the danger from Saddam Hussein and the insecurity of Israel. The insecurity of Palestinians in the 36th year of military occupation is not an unsolved problem. In fact, it remains unmentioned. The steps that undermine the prospects for a peaceful diplomatic settlement are continually justified as a response to Palestinian terror, which did indeed escalate, including terrible crimes against Israeli civilians during the Al-Aqsa Intifada that broke out at the end of September 2000. The Intifada also brought into the open significant changes that had been taking place within Israel. The authority of the Israeli military by then reached such levels that military correspondent Ben Caspit described the country as not a state with an army, but an army with a state. Caspit's analysis is basically confirmed, and deepened historically, by another prominent military correspondent, Reuven Pedatzer, reviewing Israel's culture of power and consistent choice of the military option over peaceful means since its founding. In his discussion of a book by military historian Madi Golani, Pedatzer writes that Golani is, of course, correct in his bald denial of the sacrosanct Israeli ethos according to which Israel has always aspired to peace, whereas its neighbors have consistently refused to tread the path of peace, choosing the path of war instead. The facts are sharply different, both agree. One prime reason is the institutionalization of power and its total transfer to the responsibility of the political and military establishments. The military command intervenes in political diplomatic debate, sometimes by threat of force, effectively formulating policy to an extent unknown in any other democratic society. Guided by this military culture, Israel's political military leadership uses fear-mongering tactics in security issues, generating anxiety in order to mobilize Israeli society and to deflect the public's gaze from domestic problems, such as a deteriorating economic situation or a growing unemployment rate. The formula, familiar enough elsewhere, including the U.S., was established by Israel's founding father David Ben-Gurion in the earliest days of the state, and fear-mongering would be used in the following decades, to the present. Author and reviewer join other Israeli commentators in warning of the serious danger of the formation of a consensus, according to which, in Israel's situation, democratic considerations are a luxury, with signs of fascism. Caspit's observations were motivated by the utter contempt shown by the military command for the orders of the civilian government in the early months of the Intifada, a stance that is particularly noteworthy since the Prime Minister was a former chief of staff and other civilian officials were also from the upper military echelons. Like other powerful military forces facing largely defenseless opponents, the IDF instantly resorted to extreme violence. When the head of military intelligence requested an inquiry into how many bullets the IDF fired from the start of the hostilities, he and other generals were shocked to learn that in the first few days of the Intifada the IDF fired 1 million bullets, and other projectiles, a bullet for each child, one officer of the High Command commented with disgust. Military sources confirmed a report that in one incident, a single shot, fired in the air to illustrate the reality to a European observer, evoked 2 solid hours of intense fire from Israeli troops and tanks. According to IDF accounting, the ratio of Palestinian to Israeli dead was almost 20-1 in the first month of the Intifada, 75 Palestinians, for Israelis, in areas under military occupation, with resistance scarcely going beyond stone throwing. The Army's force of huge, U.S.-provided bulldozers was also called into action to destroy dwellings, fields, olive groves, and forests with utter abandon, following policies that have made Israel synonymous with bulldozer. One correspondent wrote with dismay, reversing founding ideals about making the desert bloom. From the outset, Israel used U.S. military helicopters to attack civilian targets, killing and wounding dozens of people. Clinton responded instantly with the largest deal in a decade for military helicopters. There were no constraints on use, the Pentagon informed journalists. The facts, well known at once, were unreported in the U.S. Israel was breaking no new ground. U.S. forces in the Gulf War in 1991 enjoyed such overwhelming military superiority that troops could enter Iraq behind plows mounted on tanks and earthmovers, which bulldozed live Iraqi soldiers into trenches in the desert, an unprecedented tactic, Patrick Sloyan reported. Not a single American was killed during the attack that made an Iraqi body count impossible. The victims were mostly Shiite and Kurdish peasant conscripts, it appears, hapless victims of Saddam Hussein hiding in holes in the sand or fleeing for their lives. The report elicited little interest or comment. Such slaughters are not only routine when there is an overwhelming disparity of force, but are often lauded by the perpetrators. To select an illustration concerning the non-Muslim member of the axis of evil, it is unlikely that North Koreans have forgotten the object lesson in air power to all the communists in the world and especially to the communists in North Korea. That was delivered in May 1953, a month before the armistice, and reported enthusiastically in a U.S. Air Force study. There were no targets left in the flattened country, so U.S. bombers were dispatched to destroy irrigation dams, furnishing 75% of the controlled rice supply for North Korea's rice production. The Westerner can little conceive the awesome meaning which the loss of this staple commodity has for the Asian. Starvation and slow death, the official account continues, recounting the kinds of crimes that led to death sentences at Nuremberg. One may wonder whether such memories are in the background as the desperate North Korean leadership plays nuclear chicken. It is important to be aware of how routine these practices are, hence how likely they are to recur unless inhibited from within the powerful states. We can observe with horror the ruins of Grozny, and if historical memory is allowed, can recall the devastation left by U.S. saturation bombing in Indochina. Revenge knows few limits when the privileged and powerful are subjected to the kind of terror they regularly mete out to their victims. To take an example from earlier years, when British citizens were murdered in the course of a rebellion in occupied India 150 years ago, the Indian Mutiny, in imperial parlance, Britain's reaction was ferocious. It was a ghastly and horrible picture showing man at his worst, Nehru wrote from his prison cell during World War II, citing British and Indian sources, the latter banned under the Raj. A current scholarly history records the common practice of wanton attacks on passive villagers and unarmed Indians, even faithful domestic servants, brutal murder of captured mutineers, entire villages put to the torch for the crime of proximity to the site of real or alleged Indian atrocities, as a terrible racial ferocity erupted and inspired British vengeance. Another describes how tens of thousands of soldiers and village guerrillas were hanged, shot, or blown from guns, leading to a significant drop in population in several regions. The tone is illustrated by the advice in May 1857 by John Nicholson, the hero of Delhi, an upright man, and professed Christian, according to his contemporary admirers, "Let us propose a bill for the flaying alive, impalement or burning of the murderers of the women and children at Delhi." The idea of simply hanging the perpetrators of such atrocities is maddening. The atrocities to which he referred included those revealed in detailed but imaginary accounts of other righteous Christians, who carried out unspeakable atrocities in revenge. To illustrate the impact of the sobering lessons of World War II, In Kenya in the 1950s, some 150,000 people died in the course of Britain's repression of a colonial revolt, a campaign conducted with hideous terror and atrocities but, as always, guided by the highest ideals. The British governor had explained to the people of Kenya in 1946 that Britain controls their land and resources, as of right, the product of historical events which reflect the greatest glory of our fathers and grandfathers. If the greater part of the wealth of the country is at present in our hands, that is because this land we have made is our land by right of achievement, and Africans will simply have to learn to live in a world which we have made, under the humanitarian impulses of the late 19th and the 20th century. History is replete with precedents for what we see before our eyes, day after day, though the stakes grow more awesome along with the means of destruction available. Israeli commanders rely not only on the standard military doctrine of those who have overwhelming force at their command, but also on their own experience. When they ordered massive violence to crush Palestinians with cruel, collective punishment in October 2000, they probably did not anticipate that the tactics would arouse the victims to bloody revenge. That did not happen when Prime Minister Rabin sent his troops to crush the population of the territories by breaking bones, beatings, torture, and humiliation during the First Intifada a decade earlier. Then the tactics largely worked, as they had in the past. In December 1982, after an outburst of settler and IDF terror and atrocities in the territories that shocked even Israeli hawks, a prominent Israeli academic specialist on military affairs warned of the dangers to Israeli society when 750,000 young people who have served in the IDF know that the task of the army is not only to defend the state in the battlefield against a foreign army, but to demolish the rights of innocent people just because they are Arabushim living in territories that God promised to us. The essential principle had been formulated in the early years of the occupation by Moshe Dayan. Israel should tell the Palestinians in the territories that, we have no solution, you shall continue to live like dogs, and whoever wishes may leave, and we will see where this process leads. But the Palestinians remained Sami Din, who endured but scarcely retaliated. The Second Intifada was different. This time the orders to crush Palestinians relentlessly and teach them not to raise their heads escalated the cycle of violence, spilling into Israel itself, which had lost the substantial immunity to retaliation from within the territories that had prevailed for more than 3 decades of military occupation. Echoing the concerns of 20 years earlier, an editorial in Israel's leading daily concluded that 2.5 years of intense fighting against Palestinian terrorism have turned the Israel Defense Forces into an obdurate and callous army, focused on its mission out of an indifference to the consequences of its actions. The IDF, which brought up generations of soldiers on the myth of purity of arms and educated its commanders with the idea of the moral, deliberating soldier, who takes tough decisions, while thinking of humane considerations, is turning into a killing machine whose efficiency is awe-inspiring, yet shocking. As the official ratio of Palestinians to Israelis killed moved from 20-1 to close to 3-1, attitudes in the U.S. changed from inattention to atrocities or support for them to extreme outrage at the atrocities directed at innocent U.S. clients. These were indeed outrageous. The selective vision, however, speaks for itself, not least because of its deep roots in the culture and history of conquerors. Chapter 8. Terrorism and Justice, Some Useful Truisms. On a highly controversial topic like the one we turn to now, perhaps it is a good idea to begin with a few simple truths. The first is that actions are evaluated in terms of the range of likely consequences. A second is the principle of universality. We apply to ourselves the same standards we apply to others, if not more stringent ones. Apart from being the merest truisms, these principles are also the foundation of just war theory, at least any version of it that deserves to be taken seriously. The truisms raise an empirical question: are they accepted? Investigation will reveal, I believe, that they are rejected almost without exception. The first truism may merit a word of elaboration. The actual consequences of an action may be highly significant, but they do not bear on the moral evaluation of the action. No one celebrates Khrushchev's success in placing nuclear missiles in Cuba because it did not lead to nuclear war, or condemns the fearmongers who warned of the threat. Nor do we applaud North Korea's dear leader for developing nuclear weapons and providing missile technology to Pakistan, or denounce those who warn of possible consequences because they haven't taken place. An apologist for state violence who took such positions would be regarded as a moral monster or lunatic. That's obvious, until it comes time to apply the same criteria to ourselves. Then the stance of the lunatic and moral monster is taken to be highly honorable, indeed obligatory, and adherence to the truisms is condemned with horror. Let us, nevertheless, accept the truisms for what they are, truisms. And then think about a few crucial current cases to which they apply. Truisms and terror. Take 9 to 11. It is widely argued that the terrorist attacks changed everything dramatically as the world entered a new and frightening age of terror. The title of a collection of academic essays by Yale University scholars and others. It is also widely held that the term terror is very hard to define. We might ask why the concept of terror should be considered particularly obscure. There are official U.S. government definitions that fall well within the range of clarity of other usages that are regarded as unproblematic. A U.S. Army manual defined terrorism as the calculated use of violence or threat of violence to attain goals that are political, religious, or ideological in nature, through intimidation, coercion, or instilling fear. The official U.S. Code gave a more elaborate definition, essentially along the same lines. The British government's definition is similar: terrorism is the use, or threat, of action which is violent, damaging or disrupting, and is intended to influence the government or intimidate the public and is for the purpose of advancing a political, religious, or ideological cause. These definitions seem fairly clear. They are close enough to ordinary usage, and are considered appropriate when discussing the terrorism of enemies. The official U.S. definitions are the ones I have been using in writing about the topic since the Reagan administration came into office in 1981, declaring that a war on terror would be a centerpiece of its foreign policy. The reliance on these definitions is particularly appropriate for our purposes because they were formulated when the first war on terror was declared. But almost no one uses them, and they have been rescinded, replaced by nothing sensible. The reasons do not seem obscure. The official definitions of terrorism are virtually the same as the definitions of counterterror, sometimes called low-intensity conflict, or counterinsurgency. But counterterror is official U.S. policy, and it plainly will not do to say that the U.S. is officially committed to terrorism. The U.S. is by no means alone in this practice. It is traditional for states to call their own terrorism counterterror, even the worst mass murderers, the Nazis, for example. In occupied Europe, they claimed to be defending the population and legitimate governments from the partisans, terrorists supported from abroad. That was not entirely false. Even the most egregious propaganda rarely is. The partisans were undoubtedly directed from London, and they did engage in terror. The U.S. military had some appreciation of the Nazi perspective. Its counterinsurgency doctrine was modeled on Nazi manuals, which were analyzed sympathetically, with the assistance of Wehrmacht officers. It is this common practice that allows for the conventional thesis that terror is a weapon of the weak. That is true, by definition, if terror is restricted to their terrorism. If the doctrinal requirement is lifted, however, we find that, like most weapons, terror is primarily a weapon of the powerful. Another problem with the official definitions of terror is that it follows from them that the U.S. is a leading terrorist state. That much is hardly controversial, at least among those who believe that we should pay some attention to such institutions as the International Court of Justice, or the UN Security Council, or mainstream scholarship, as the examples of Nicaragua and Cuba unequivocally reveal. But that conclusion won't do either. So we are left with no sensible definition of terrorism, unless we decide to break ranks and use the official definitions that have been abandoned because of their unacceptable consequences. The official definitions do not answer every question precisely. They do not, for example, draw a sharp boundary between international terrorism and aggression, or between terror and resistance. These issues have arisen in interesting ways, which have direct bearing on the redeclared war on terror and on today's headlines. Take the distinction between terror and resistance. One question that arises is the legitimacy of actions to realize the right to self-determination, freedom, and independence, as derived from the Charter of the United Nations, of people forcibly deprived of that right. Particularly peoples under colonial and racist regimes and foreign occupation. Do such actions fall under terror or resistance? The quoted words are from the most forceful denunciation of the crime of terrorism by the UN General Assembly, which stated further that nothing in the present resolution could in any way prejudice the right so defined. The resolution was adopted in December 1987, just as officially recognized international terrorism reached its peak. It is obviously important. The vote was 153 to 2, with a single abstention, Honduras, hence even more important. The two countries that voted against the resolution were the usual ones. Their reason, they explained at the UN session, was the paragraph just quoted. The phrase, colonial and racist regimes, was understood to refer to their ally, apartheid South Africa. Evidently, the US and Israel could not condone resistance to the apartheid regime, particularly when it was led by Mandela's African National Congress, one of the world's more notorious terrorist groups, as Washington determined at the time. The other phrase, foreign occupation, was understood to refer to Israel's military occupation, then in its 20th year. Evidently, resistance could not be condoned in that case either. The US and Israel were alone in the world in denying that such actions can be legitimate resistance, and declaring them to be terrorism. The US-Israeli stand extends beyond the occupied territories. Thus the US and Israel regard Hezbollah, for example, as one of the leading terrorist organizations in the world, not because of its terrorist acts, which are real, but because it was formed to resist the Israeli occupation of southern Lebanon, and succeeded in driving out the invaders after 2 decades of defiance of Security Council orders to withdraw. The U.S. even goes so far as to call people terrorists if they resist direct U.S. aggression, the South Vietnamese, for example, or recently, the Iraqis. The public knows nothing about the major UN condemnation of what Reagan called the evil scourge of terrorism and its fate, by virtue of the usual double veto. To learn about such matters one has to wander into forbidden territory, the historical and documentary record, or marginalized critical literature. Despite the unclarities, and the sharp divide between the U.S., Israel, and the world, the official U.S. definitions of terror seem fairly adequate to the purposes at hand. Let us turn to the belief that 9/11 signaled a sharp change in the course of history. That seems questionable. Nonetheless, something dramatically new and different did happen on that terrible day. The target was not Cuba, or Nicaragua, or Lebanon, or Chechnya, or one of the other traditional victims of international terrorism, but a state with enormous power to shape the future. For the first time, an attack on the rich and powerful countries succeeded on a scale that is, regrettably, not unfamiliar in their traditional domains. Alongside horror at the crime against humanity and sympathy for the victims, commentators outside the ranks of Western privilege often responded to the 9/11 atrocities with a "welcome to the club," particularly in Latin America, where it is not so easy to forget the plague of violence and repression that swept through the region from the early 1960s, or its roots. The plague can in part be traced to a decision by the Kennedy administration in 1962 to change the mission of the Latin American military, effectively, from hemispheric defense to internal security. The effect was a shift from toleration of the rapacity and cruelty of the Latin American military to direct complicity in their crimes, to support for the methods of Heinrich Himmler's extermination squads, in the words of Charles Machling, who led U.S. counterinsurgency and internal defense planning from 1961 to 1966. The perception of the victims is similar. To take one case of unusual current significance, the highly respected president of the Colombian Permanent Committee for Human Rights, Alfredo Vázquez Carrizosa, writes that the Kennedy administration took great pains to transform our regular armies into counterinsurgency brigades, accepting the new strategy of the death squads, ushering in what is known in Latin America as the national security doctrine, not defense against an external enemy, but a way to make the military establishment the masters of the game, with the right to combat the internal enemy. It is the right to fight and to exterminate social workers, trade unionists, men and women who are not supportive of the establishment, and who are assumed to be communist extremists. And this could mean anyone, including human rights activists such as myself. The great pains to which he refers coincided with the fateful 1962 decision. In that year, Kennedy sent a Special Forces mission to Colombia, led by General William Yarborough. Yarborough advised paramilitary, sabotage and/or terrorist activities against known communist proponents to be employed now. If we have such an apparatus in place, because there is no need to prevaricate in secret communications. In counterinsurgency doctrine, the phrase known communist proponents extends to the categories of assumed communist extremists that Vázquez Carrizosa enumerates, a fact well known to Latin Americans, just as they know that the primary victims are the poor and oppressed who are daring to raise their heads. The national security doctrine reached Central America in the 1980s. El Salvador became the leading recipient of U.S. military aid as state terror reached its awful peak. When Congress hampered direct military aid and training by imposing human rights conditions, as in Guatemala after massive government atrocities, surrogates undertook the task. The victims do not easily forget, though among the powerful, these crimes are subject to the standard ritual avoidance of unacceptable facts. Hardly a day passes without examples. Thus, a front-page story in the national press warns that the threat of Al-Qaeda is increasing, as it is turning from targets that are well protected to so-called soft targets. The story should at once recall Washington's official instructions to its proxy forces to attack soft targets in Nicaragua immediately after it was ordered by the highest international authorities to terminate its terrorist war, and the reaction to these orders. Whether attacking soft targets is right or wrong, terrorism or a noble cause, depends on who is the agent. The practice is routine and unproblematic once moral truisms have been deemed irrelevant and unwanted facts efficiently disappeared. The art of disappearing unwanted facts. One contributor to the Yale volume, Charles Hill, observed that 9/11 opened the Second War on Terror, the first having been declared by the Reagan administration 20 years earlier, a rare recognition of reality. And we won the first war, Hill reports triumphantly, though the terrorist monster was only wounded, not slain. How we won is someone else's department. The Jesuit intellectuals in Central America, the School of the Americas, truth commissions, serious scholarship, activist and solidarity literature, and the memories of the survivors. We can learn a good deal about the current war on terror by inquiring into the first phase, and how it is now portrayed. One leading academic specialist describes the 1980s as the decade of state terrorism, of persistent state involvement, or sponsorship, of terrorism, especially by Libya and Iran. The U.S. merely responded with a proactive stance toward terrorism. Others recommend the methods by which we won. The operations for which the U.S. was condemned by the World Court and Security Council, absent the veto, are a model for Nicaragua-like support for the Taliban's adversaries. A prominent historian of the subject, David Rappaport, finds deep roots for the terrorism of Osama bin Laden in South Vietnam, where the effectiveness of Viet Cong terror against the American Goliath armed with modern technology kindled hopes that the Western heartland was vulnerable too. The villainy of the terrorists attacking us everywhere is awesome indeed. Keeping to convention, these analyses portray the U.S. as a benign victim, defending itself from the terror of others, the Vietnamese, in South Vietnam, the Nicaraguans, in Nicaragua, Libyans and Iranians. If they ever suffered a slight at U.S. hands, it passes unnoticed, and other anti-American forces worldwide. If not everyone in the world shares that perception of history, then they too are anti-American, and can be safely dismissed. As discussed earlier, the plague of U.S.-backed state terror that spread through Latin America in the 1960s, peaked in Central America in the 1980s, as Reagan's War on Terror took its deadly toll. Central America was one prime focus of that onslaught. The other was the Mideast/Mediterranean region. Here, too, the contrast between what actually happened and what is portrayed is dramatic and revealing. In this region, the worst single atrocity during the 1980s was the Israeli invasion of Lebanon in 1982, which, like the murderous and destructive Rabin-Peres invasions of 1993 and 1996, had little pretense of self-defense. In the light of crucial Reagan-Clinton support, these operations add to Washington's record of state-supported international terrorism. The U.S. was directly involved in many other acts of terror in the region, including the 3 candidates for the prize of most extreme terrorist atrocity of 1985, when terrorism in that region was selected by editors as the lead story of the year. 1. The car bomb outside a mosque in Beirut that killed 80 people, mostly women and girls, and wounded 250 others, timed to explode as people were leaving and traced back to the CIA and British intelligence. 2. Shimon Peres's bombing of Tunis, killing 75 people, Palestinians and Tunisians, expedited by the U.S. and praised by Secretary of State Shultz, then unanimously condemned by the UN Security Council as an act of armed aggression, U.S. abstaining, and 3. Peres's Iron Fist operations directed against what the Israeli High Command called terrorist villagers in occupied Lebanon, reaching new depths of calculated brutality and arbitrary murder. In the words of a Western diplomat familiar with the area, amply supported by direct coverage, total casualties unknown in accord with the usual conventions. All these atrocities fall within the category of state-supported international terrorism, if not the more severe war crime of aggression. This accounting excludes many other atrocities, such as the regular kidnappings and killings on the high seas by Israeli naval forces attacking ships in transit between Cyprus and northern Lebanon, with many of those captured brought to Israel and kept in prison without charge as hostages, and numerous other crimes that are not crimes because they were backed by Washington. In journalism and scholarship on terrorism, 1985 is recognized to be the peak year of Middle East terrorism, but not because of these events, rather, because of 2 terrorist atrocities in which a single person was murdered, in each case an American. In the worst of the 2 terrorist atrocities that passed through the doctrinal filters, a crippled American Jew, Leon Klinghoffer, was brutally murdered during the hijacking of the Achille Lauro cruise ship in October 1985, by a Palestinian terrorist group led by Abu Abbas. The murder seemed to set a standard for remorselessness among terrorists, New York Times correspondent John Burns wrote. Burns described Abu Abbas as the has-been monster who may finally have to face a day of reckoning with American justice for his role in the crime. One of the heralded achievements of the invasion of Iraq was the capture of Abu Abbas a few months later. The Klinghoffer murder remains the most vivid and lasting symbol of the ineradicable evil of Arab terrorism, and the unanswerable proof that there can be no negotiating with these vermin. The atrocity was very real, and is in no way mitigated by the terrorists' plea that the hijacking was in retaliation for the far more murderous US-backed Israeli terrorist attack on Tunis a week earlier. But the bombing of Tunis does not enter the canon of terrorism because it is subject to the wrong agent fallacy. It remained unmentioned when Abu Abbas was captured. There would of course be no difficulty in apprehending the monsters Shimon Peres and George Shultz, who are far from has-beens, and bringing them to a day of reckoning with American justice. But that is beyond unthinkable. Also efficiently disappeared are recent events that bear more than a superficial similarity to the Klinghoffer murder. The reaction was silence when British reporters found the flattened remains of a wheelchair in the remnants of the Jenin refugee camp after Sharon's spring 2002 offensive. It had been utterly crushed, ironed flat as if in a cartoon, they reported. In the middle of the debris lay a broken white flag. A crippled Palestinian, Kamal Zughair, was shot dead as he tried to wheel himself up the road. The Israeli tanks must have driven over the body, because when a friend found it, one leg and both arms were missing, and the face, he said, had been ripped in two. If even reported in the U.S., this would have been dismissed as an inadvertent error in the course of justified retaliation. Kamal Zughayer does not deserve to enter the annals of terrorism along with Leon Klinghoffer. His murder was not under the command of a monster, but a man of peace, who enjoys a soulful relation with the man of vision in the White House. The basic dynamic at work was outlined 20 years ago by one of Israel's most eminent writers and commentators, Boaz Evren, after an upsurge of settler IDF violence that caused much consternation in Israel. Evren wrote a sardonic account of how to deal with the lower orders, the Yerabushim in Israeli slang. Israel should keep them on a short leash, he wrote, so that they recognize that the whip is held over their head. As long as not too many people are being visibly killed, then Western humanists will accept it all peacefully, and even ask, what is so terrible? The guardians of journalistic integrity in the U.S. understand the lesson without Evren's advice. The most prestigious media watchdog, the Columbia Journalism Review, gave its cherished laurel to the U.S. media for their coverage of Sharon's spring 2002 offensive in Jenin, Nablus, Ramallah, and elsewhere, in the 35th year of Israel's occupation of the West Bank and Gaza. The recipients earned the laurel, according to the review, for ensuring that scrutiny of the offensive would focus on one cardinal question. Was there a purposeful massacre of hundreds of civilians in the Jenin refugee camp? If not, then civilized people can accept it all peacefully. We might try a thought experiment. Suppose that Syria had occupied Israel for 35 years, employing the means and measures of Israel's occupation, and then proceeded further to duplicate Sharon's 2002 offensive, rampaging through Jewish towns, leveling large areas with bulldozers and tanks, keeping the population under siege for weeks without food or water or access to medical care, destroying cultural centers and the institutions of government and archaeological treasures, making it crystal clear to the Yids in every possible way that the whip is held over their head, but not slaughtering hundreds of them at once. According to the standards of the laurel, only an anti-Arab racist would object, and discovery of the scattered parts of a murdered Jewish cripple in a wheelchair crushed by a Syrian tank would merit no notice, let alone stern American justice. Reviewing the Jenin story, the review berated the British press for embracing Israel's guilt as established fact, and ridiculed the UN for preparing an investigation by a team whose political sympathies ensured that its conclusions would be challenged, certainly by the independent thinkers of the review. Amid all this confounding din, the editors asked, what was the world to believe? Fortunately, all was not lost. Enter the independent U.S. news media, on a fact-finding mission of their own, which refuted the anti-Israel slanders and revealed that there was no deliberate, cold-blooded murder of hundreds at Jenin, in fact, reaching exactly the same conclusions as the disreputable British media, and others, which, however, did not adopt the framework of U.S.-Israeli propaganda as rigidly as the editors of the review demand, and scrutinized the Israeli invasion beyond that single question. The independent U.S. media did not merit the insulting praise of their cheerleader. Careful readers could learn about the crimes that had taken place, though not in the shocking detail presented in the Israeli and European press. And they were carefully protected from the complicity of their own government, in routine fashion. when the wrong agents are implicated in state-supported international terrorism. We sometimes discover that terrorist atrocities are not fully effaced, but rather praised. An instructive case is the country that replaced El Salvador as the leading recipient of U.S. military aid and training, Turkey, where state terror was practiced on a massive scale through the Clinton years, relying on U.S. support. I borrow the term state terror from the Turkish State Minister for Human Rights, referring to the vast atrocities against Kurds in 1994, and from sociologist Ismail Basikci, returned to prison after publishing his book State Terror in the Near East, having already served 15 years for recording Turkish repression of Kurds. As elsewhere, unacceptable facts were disappeared, but the events did not pass entirely unnoticed. The State Department's year 2000 report on Washington's efforts to combat terrorism singled out Turkey for its positive experiences in combating terror, along with Algeria and Spain, worthy colleagues. This praise was reported without comment in a front-page story in the New York Times by its specialist on terrorism. In a leading journal of international affairs, Ambassador Robert Pearson reports that the U.S. could have no better friend and ally than Turkey in its efforts to eliminate terrorism worldwide, thanks to the capabilities of Turkey's armed forces demonstrated in their anti-terror campaign in the Kurdish southeast. As noted, the voluntary U.S. censorship of Turkish state terror was eased slightly in early 2003 during Turkey's democratic deviation, though the decisive role of the United States remained well concealed. The considerations just reviewed, a small sample, suggest one simple way to reduce the threat of terror: stop participating in it. That would be a significant contribution to a general war on terror. Nevertheless, it would not address the category of terror that passes through the doctrinal filters. Their terror against us and our clients, an extremely serious matter, no doubt. Let us put that issue aside for a moment and consider a related domain in which attention to truisms may have some value. Truisms and just war theory. The theory of just war has enjoyed a revival in the context of the new era of humanitarian intervention and international terrorism. Consider the strongest case put forth, the bombing of Afghanistan, a paradigm example of just war, according to the Western consensus. The respected moral political philosopher Jean Bethke Elston summarizes received opinion fairly accurately when she writes that nearly everyone, with the exception of absolute pacifists and those who seem to think we should let ourselves be slaughtered with impunity, because so many people out there hate us, agrees that the bombing of Afghanistan was clearly a just war. To mention just one additional example, New York Times columnist Bill Keller, now executive editor, remarks that when America dispatched soldiers in the cause of regime change in Afghanistan, the opposition was mostly limited to the people who are reflexively against the American use of power, either timid supporters or isolationists, the doctrinaire left and the soft-headed types Christopher Hitchens described as people who, discovering a viper in the bed of their child, would place the first call to people for the ethical treatment of animals. These are empirical statements, so despite the near unanimity of the declarations, we are entitled to ask whether they are true. Let's ignore the fact that regime change was not the cause of war in Afghanistan but rather an afterthought late in the game. Were there opponents of the bombing who were not either absolute pacifists or absolute lunatics? It turns out that there were, and the opponents formed an interesting collection. To begin with, they apparently included the great majority of the population of the world when the bombing was announced. So we discover from an international Gallup poll in late September 2001. The lead question was this: once the identity of the terrorists is known, should the American government launch a military attack on the country or countries where the terrorists are based? Or should the American government seek to extradite the terrorists to stand trial? Whether such diplomatic means could have succeeded is known only to ideological extremists on both sides. Tentative explorations of extradition by the Taliban were instantly rebuffed by Washington, which also refused to provide evidence for its accusations. World opinion strongly favored diplomatic judicial measures over military action. In Europe, support for military action ranged from 8% in Greece to 29% in France. Support was least in Latin America, the region that has the most experience with U.S. intervention. It ranged from 2% in Mexico to 11% in Colombia and Venezuela. The sole exception was Panama, where only 80% preferred peaceful means, 16% military attack. Support for strikes that included civilian targets was much less. Even in the two countries polled that supported the use of military force, India and Israel, where the reasons were parochial, considerable majorities opposed such attacks. There was, then, overwhelming opposition to Washington's actual policies, which not only included civilian targets but even turned major urban concentrations into ghost towns. From the first moment, the press reported. The Gallup poll was not reported in the U.S., though it was elsewhere, including Latin America. Notice that even this very limited support for the bombing was based on a crucial presupposition, that those responsible for 9/11 were known. But they were not, as the government quietly informed us 8 months after the bombing. In June 2002, FBI Director Robert Mueller testified before a Senate committee, delivering what the press described as some of his most detailed public comments on the origins of the attacks of 9/11. Mueller informed the Senate that investigators believe the idea of the September 11th attacks on the World Trade Center and Pentagon came from al-Qaeda leaders in Afghanistan, though the plotting and financing may trace to Germany and the United Arab Emirates. We think the masterminds of it were in Afghanistan, high in the al-Qaeda leadership, Mueller said. If the indirect responsibility of Afghanistan could only be surmised in June 2002, it evidently could not have been known 8 months before, when President Bush ordered the bombing of Afghanistan. According to the FBI, then, the bombing was a war crime, an act of aggression, based on mere supposition. It also follows directly that there was virtually no detectable world support for the policies actually undertaken, since even the minimal support recorded by polls was based on a presupposition that Washington and London knew to be false. Perhaps the former director of Human Rights Watch Africa, now a professor of law at Emory University, spoke for many others around the world when he addressed the International Council on Human Rights Policy in Geneva in January 2002, saying that, "I am unable to appreciate any moral, political or legal difference between this jihad by the United States against those it deems to be its enemies and the jihad by Islamic groups against those they deem to be their enemies." What about Afghan opinion? Information is scanty but not entirely lacking. In late October 2001, after 3 weeks of intense bombing, 1,000 Afghan leaders gathered in Peshawar, some exiles, some coming from within Afghanistan, all committed to overthrowing the Taliban regime. It was a rare display of unity among tribal elders, Islamic scholars, fractious politicians, and former guerrilla commanders, the press reported. They had many disagreements but unanimously urged the U.S. to stop the air raids, and appealed to the international media to call for an end to the bombing of innocent people. They urged that other means be adopted to overthrow the hated Taliban regime, a goal they believed could be achieved without further death and destruction. A similar message was conveyed by Afghan opposition leader Abdul Haq, who was highly regarded in Washington, and by Afghan President Hamid Karzai. Just before he entered Afghanistan without U.S. support, and was then captured and killed, Haq condemned the bombing then underway and criticized the U.S. for refusing to back his efforts and those of others to create a revolt within the Taliban. The bombing was a big setback for these efforts, he said. The U.S. is trying to show its muscle, score a victory, and scare everyone in the world. They don't care about the suffering of the Afghans or how many people we will lose. The prominent Afghan women's organization ROA, which received some belated recognition when it became ideologically serviceable to express concern about the fate of women in Afghanistan, also bitterly condemned the bombing. Among other opponents of the bombing were the major aid and relief agencies, deeply concerned over the likely effect on the population, agreeing with academic specialists that the bombing posed a grave risk of starvation for millions of people. In short, the lunatic fringe was not insubstantial. Let us turn now to the most elementary principle of just war theory, universality. Those who cannot accept this principle should have the decency to keep silent about matters of right and wrong, or just war. If we can rise to this level, some obvious questions arise. For example, have Cuba and Nicaragua been entitled to set off bombs in Washington, New York, and Miami in self-defense against ongoing terrorist attack? Particularly so when the perpetrators are well known and act with complete impunity, sometimes in brazen defiance of the highest international authorities, so that the cases are far clearer than Afghanistan? If not, why not? Certainly one cannot appeal to the scale of crimes to justify such a stand. The merest look at the factual record bars that move. If these questions are not answered, just war pronouncements cannot be taken seriously. I have yet to discover a single case where the questions are even raised. That leads to some conclusions that may not be particularly attractive, but that might merit attention and self-examination, and serious concern about the long-term implications of the apparent inability to accept the principle of universality that underlies these failures. Although the critical questions are not answered, or in fact even raised, related issues occasionally do come up, and in a manner that gives some useful insight into the prevailing moral and intellectual culture. The Latin American correspondent of the New York Times informs us that Latin American intellectuals have, reflexively accorded, anti-American leaders immunity to the moral standards applied to other leaders. His evidence is a statement by Latin American intellectuals warning against a post-Iraq invasion of Cuba. He believes a psychological explanation may be necessary to account for their failure to adopt universal moral standards. No psychological explanation seems necessary, however, when he and his associates reflexively accord their leaders immunity to the moral standards they apply to others, specifically, the moral standards that would call for severe punishment for anyone else who dared to carry out terrorist wars comparable to those that their leaders have conducted against Cuba and Nicaragua. Consider how Elshton's argument on Afghanistan fares within her own framework. She formulates 4 criteria for just war. First, force is justified if it protects the innocent from certain harm, Her sole example is when a country has certain knowledge that genocide will commence on a certain date, and the victims have no means of self-defense. Second, the war must be openly declared or otherwise authorized by a legitimate authority. Third, it must begin with the right intentions. Fourth, it must be a last resort after other possibilities for the redress and defense of the values at stake have been explored. The first condition is inapplicable to Afghanistan. The second and third are meaningless. An open declaration of war by an aggressor confers no support whatsoever for a claim of just war. The worst criminals claim right intentions, and there are always acolytes to endorse the claims. The fourth obviously does not apply in Afghanistan. Therefore, her paradigm case collapses entirely, under her own criteria. That aside, whatever one thinks of Elshton's belief that the bombing of Afghanistan met her conditions, these conditions hold with far greater clarity for many of the victims of U.S. state-supported international terrorism. On her own grounds, then, these victims should be granted the right to wage a just war against the U.S. by bombing and terror, as long as it is openly declared and accompanied by a pronouncement of right intentions. The reduction to absurdity, however, presupposes that we adopt the principle of universality, unmentioned in her historical/philosophical study and tacitly rejected in the standard fashion. Let's bring in some further relevant facts. The official motive for the bombing of Afghanistan was to force the Taliban to hand over people that the U.S. suspected of involvement in the crimes of 9/11. The U.S. refused, however, to provide any evidence. At the time when Taliban reluctance to comply was the lead story of the day, arousing much fury, Haiti renewed its request for extradition of Emmanuel Constant, leader of the paramilitary forces that had primary responsibility for the brutal murder of thousands of Haitians. During the early 1990s, when the military junta was supported, not so tacitly, by the first Bush and Clinton administrations. The request apparently did not even merit a response, or more than the barest report. Constant had been sentenced in absentia in Haiti. It is widely assumed that the U.S. is concerned that if he testifies, he may reveal contacts between the state terrorists and Washington. Does Haiti therefore have the right to set off bombs in Washington? Or to try to kidnap or kill Constant in New York, where he lives, killing bystanders in approved Israeli style? If not, why not? Why is the question not even raised in this case, or in that of other murderous state terrorists who enjoy safe haven in the U.S.? And if the question is considered too absurd even to consider, as it is, by elementary moral standards, where does that leave the consensus on the resort to violence by one's own leaders? Referring to 9/11, some argue that the evil of terrorism is absolute, and merits a reciprocally absolute doctrine. In response, ferocious military assault in accord with the Bush doctrine that, if you harbor terrorists, you're a terrorist, if you aid and abet terrorists, you're a terrorist, and you will be treated like one. It would be hard to find anyone who accepts the doctrine that massive bombing is a legitimate response to terrorist crimes. No sane person would agree that bombing Washington would be legitimate in accord with the reciprocally absolute doctrine on response to terrorist atrocities, or a justified and properly calibrated response to them. If there is some reason why this observation is inappropriate, it has yet to be articulated, even contemplated, as far as I have been able to discover. Consider some of the legal arguments that have been presented to justify the US-UK bombing of Afghanistan. Christopher Greenwood argues that the U.S. has the right of self-defense against those who caused or threatened death and destruction, appealing to the World Court ruling in the Nicaragua case. The paragraph he cites applies far more clearly to the U.S. war against Nicaragua than to the Taliban or Al-Qaeda. So if it is taken to justify intensive U.S. bombardment and ground attack in Afghanistan, then Nicaragua should have been entitled to carry out much more severe attacks against the U.S. Another distinguished professor of international law, Thomas Frank, supports the US-UK war on grounds that a state is responsible for the consequences of permitting its territory to be used to injure another state. The principle is surely applicable to the US in the case of Nicaragua, Cuba, and many other examples. Needless to say, in no such case would an appeal to the right of self-defense against continuing acts of death and destruction be remotely tolerable acts, not merely threats. The same holds for more nuanced proposals for an appropriate response to terrorist atrocities. Military historian Michael Howard proposes a police operation conducted under the auspices of the United Nations against a criminal conspiracy whose members should be hunted down and brought before an international court, where they would receive a fair trial and, if found guilty, be awarded an appropriate sentence. Reasonable enough, though the idea that such measures be applied to the US or Britain is unthinkable. Two Oxford scholars propose a principle of proportionality. The magnitude of response will be determined by the magnitude with which the aggression interfered with key values in the society attacked. In the case of 9/11, freedom to pursue self-betterment in a plural society through market economics. That value was viciously attacked on 9/11 by aggressors with a moral orthodoxy divergent from the West. Since Afghanistan constitutes a state that sided with the aggressor and refused U.S. demands to turn over suspects, the United States and its allies, according to the principle of magnitude of interference, could justifiably and morally resort to force against the Taliban government. If the moral orthodoxy of the West accommodates the principle of universality, it follows that Cuba and Nicaragua, in fact, many others, can justifiably and morally resort to far greater force against the U.S. government. Uncontroversially, the U.S. terrorist attacks and other illegal actions against Cuba and Nicaragua interfered with key values in the society attacked, far more dramatically than in the case of 9/11, and were intended to do so. Furthermore, since Britain sided with the aggressor, Oxford too should be subject to attack, at least by Nicaragua. We are entitled to ask why the conclusion cannot even be contemplated, quite properly, of course, and what that implies about the elite intellectual culture. The conclusions with regard to the principle of universality extend far beyond these cases, including even such minor escapades, by US-UK standards, as Clinton's missile attack on the Al-Shifa pharmaceutical plant in Sudan in 1998, which led to several tens of thousands of deaths, according to the only reputable estimates we have, estimates consistent with the immediate assessment of Human Rights Watch and later reports of knowledgeable observers. A crime of even a fraction of the scale would elicit fury if the target were the US, Israel, or some other worthy victim, and retaliation of a kind that one hesitates to imagine, which would furthermore be acclaimed as a paradigm example of just war. The principle of proportionality entails that Sudan had every right to carry out massive terror in retaliation. Even more so if we adopt the more extreme view that Clinton's missile attack had appalling consequences for the economy and society of Sudan, so that the atrocity was much worse than the crimes of 9/11, which were appalling enough but did not have such consequences. Almost all of the limited commentary on the Sudan bombing keeps to the question of whether the plant was believed to produce chemical weapons. True or false, that has no bearing at all on the crime, specifically, on the magnitude with which the aggression interfered with key values in the society attacked. Many point out that the resulting deaths were unintended, so that the perpetrators, and those who disregard the consequences of the attack, are not culpable. The argument again illustrates, dramatically, the standard rejection of the principle of universality. We would never accept this stand for a moment with regard to others. Many of the atrocities we, rightly, denounce are unintended, though that is considered irrelevant, when the perpetrator is someone other than ourselves. But a much harsher conclusion follows, immediately and unequivocally. The claim that the actions were not criminal can be sustained only on the assumption that the fate of the victims was of no concern to the perpetrators. We cannot seriously doubt that the likely human consequences were understood by U.S. planners. The CIA knew as well as Human Rights Watch and many others that they were destroying the country's major source of pharmaceuticals and veterinary medicines, and what the likely effects would be. And the same conclusions could have been drawn at once, and surely can be now, by anyone who thinks that the effects of our violence on poor Africans might merit some concern. The acts can be excused, then, only on the Hegelian doctrine that Africans are mere things, whose lives have no value. Observing the attitudes and practice that prevail, those outside the ranks of Western privilege may draw their own conclusions about the moral orthodoxy of the West. Confronting terror. Let us now restrict the term terror, improperly, but in accord with near universal convention, to the subcategory that passes through the doctrinal filters. The wars contemplated as part of the redeclared war on terror are to go on for a long time. There's no telling how many wars it will take to secure freedom in the homeland, the president announced. That's fair enough. Potential threats are virtually limitless everywhere, even at home, as the anthrax attack and the failed investigations of it illustrate. Not only is the war on terror, as conceived, likely to go on for a long time, but it also did not suddenly become a crucial issue on 9/11. The terrorist attacks of that day were not entirely unexpected. Yet another reason to question the widely held belief that 9/11 signaled a sharp change in the course of history. Even readers of newspaper headlines, and surely government planners, were well aware years earlier that atrocities of the 9/11 variety might occur. After all, in 1993, one almost did occur. Organizations presumably related to those responsible for 9/11 came perilously close to blowing up the World Trade Center, and killing perhaps tens of thousands of people. It was also known, at once, that they had far more ambitious plans that were barely aborted in time. Even with the hideous consummation of these plans on 9/11, risk assessments did not significantly change. Prospects of major terrorist atrocities were publicly discussed well before 9/11. And there could have been little doubt of the nature of the radical Islamist terrorist organizations since at least 1981, when elements that formed part of the core of al-Qaeda in later years assassinated President Sadat of Egypt, or a few years later, when groups that may have been loosely related drove U.S. forces out of Beirut, killing hundreds of troops and many civilians in separate attacks. Furthermore, the thinking of those involved in these and other similar actions was reasonably well understood, certainly by the U.S. intelligence agencies that had helped to recruit, train, and arm them from 1980 and continued to work with them even as they were attacking the United States. The Dutch government inquiry into the Srebrenica massacre revealed that while radical Islamists were attempting to blow up the World Trade Center, others from the CIA-formed networks were being flown by the U.S. from Afghanistan to Bosnia, along with Iranian-backed Hezbollah fighters and a substantial supply of arms. They were being brought to support the U.S. side in the Balkan Wars, while Israel, along with Ukraine and Greece, was arming the Serbs, possibly with U.S.-supplied arms. The atrocities of 9/11 serve as a dramatic reminder of what has long been understood. The rich and powerful no longer are assured the near monopoly of violence that has largely prevailed throughout history, and with modern technology, the prospects are horrendous indeed. Though terrorism is rightly feared everywhere and is indeed an intolerable return to barbarism, it is not surprising that perceptions about its nature differ rather sharply at opposite ends of the guns, a fact that is ignored at their peril by those whom history has accustomed to immunity while they perpetrate terrible crimes, quite apart from the moral cowardice so starkly revealed. There are broad tendencies in global affairs that are expected to enhance the threat of this category of terror. Some are discussed by the U.S. National Intelligence Council, NIC, in its projections for the coming years. The NIC expects the official version of globalization to continue on course. Its evolution will be rocky, marked by chronic financial volatility and a widening economic divide. Financial volatility very likely means slower growth, extending the pattern of neoliberal globalization, for those who follow the rules, and harming mostly the poor. The NIC goes on to predict that as this form of globalization proceeds, deepening economic stagnation, political instability, and cultural alienation will foster ethnic, ideological, and religious extremism, along with the violence that often accompanies it, much of it directed against the United States. Unsurprisingly, Kenneth Waltz observes, the weak and disaffected lash out at the United States as the agent or symbol of their suffering. The same assumptions are made by military planners, a matter to which we return. Those concerned to reduce the threat of terror will attend carefully to such factors as these, and also to specific actions and long-term policies that exacerbate them. They will also distinguish carefully between the terrorist networks themselves and the larger community that provides a reservoir, from which radical terrorist cells can sometimes draw. That community includes the poor and oppressed, who are of no concern to the terrorist groups and suffer from their crimes, as well as wealthy and secular elements, who are bitter about U.S. policies and quietly express support for bin Laden, whom they detest and fear, as the conscience of Islam, because at least he reacts to these policies, even if in horrifying and disastrous ways. The distinction is elementary. Among those who wish to mitigate terrorist threats, it is understood that, unless the social, political, and economic conditions that spawned al-Qaeda and other associated groups are addressed, the United States and its allies in Western Europe and elsewhere will continue to be targeted by Islamist terrorists. Accordingly, the U.S. should, for its own self-protection, expand efforts to reduce the pathology of hatred before it mutates into even greater danger, seeking to moderate conditions that breed violence and terrorism. The key to strategically weakening al-Qaeda is to erode its fledgling support base, to wean away its supporters and potential supporters. Washington planner Paul Wolfowitz adds that it is crucial to eliminate policies that have been a huge recruiting device for al-Qaeda. Nothing can appease those who believe a clash of civilizations with the West will restore Islam as a world power, the editors of the Financial Times write. But to crush them successfully, they must be separated from their widening constituency. They add, put another way, while only might can destroy al-Qaeda, its expanding support base can be eroded only by policies Arabs and Muslims see as just. Even destruction of al-Qaeda will do little if the underlying conditions that facilitated the group's emergence and popularity, political oppression and economic marginalization, will persist. Correspondingly, continuation of Washington's backing for sordid governments can only bolster al-Qaeda's claims that the U.S. supports the oppression of Muslims and props up brutal governments. That is quite aside from specific policies regarding Palestine and Iraq and others, which have converted a generation of Arabs wooed by the United States and persuaded by its principles, to among the most vociferous critics of America's worldview, including affluent businessmen with ties to the West, U.S.-educated intellectuals, and liberal activists. Terrorist networks can be severely weakened. That happened to al-Qaeda after 9/11, thanks to the kind of police work Michael Howard recommended, notably in Germany, Pakistan, and Indonesia. But their support base has to be approached in radically different ways, by considering grievances and, if they are legitimate, addressing them in a serious way, as should be done irrespective of any threat. Delicate social and political problems cannot be bombed or missiled out of existence, two political scientists point out. By dropping bombs and firing missiles, the United States only spreads these festering problems. Violence can be likened to a virus. The more you bombard it, the more it spreads. The Financial Times editors are right to say that the terrorist atrocity in Jeddah, which occasioned their comments, was not unexpected. And more generally, that it had long been obvious that the network inspired by Osama bin Laden would use the upheaval of the Iraq War to relaunch attacks against Western targets and drum up support for its jihad. It was widely predicted by intelligence services and analysts in the mainstream that the invasion of Iraq would be likely to inspire terrorism. It is therefore not unexpected that, since the United States invaded Iraq in March, U.S. officials said, the al-Qaeda network has experienced a spike in recruitment, and there is an increase in radical fundamentalism all over the world. A UN report indicated that recruitment for al-Qaeda accelerated in 30 to 40 countries as the U.S. began building up for the Iraq invasion. An intelligence report by a European ally warns that the invasion could have a cataclysmic effect on the mobilization for al-Qaeda. That the conflict in Iraq led to a rise in recruitment for radical groups is now so clear that even U.S. officials admit it. A close observer of al-Qaeda and terrorism writes, "This is a huge setback in the war on terror." The war has, in fact, created a new terrorist haven, Iraq itself. With regard to the terrorist networks themselves, scholarship is virtually unanimous in taking them at their word, which has matched their deeds from the days when they were organized by the CIA and its associates. Their goal, in their terms, is to drive the infidels from Muslim lands, to overthrow the corrupt and brutal governments imposed and sustained by the infidels, and to institute an extremist version of Islam. They despise the Russians with passion but ceased their terrorist attacks against Russia based in Afghanistan when Russia withdrew, though these continue from Chechnya. And as bin Laden announced in 1998, the call to wage war against America was made, when it sent tens of thousands of its troops to the land of the two holy mosques over and above its support of the oppressive, corrupt and tyrannical regime that is in control. These are the reasons for the singling out of America as a target. But their goals may well become more ambitious, and their recruiting base more expansive as well, if the enthusiasts for a clash of civilizations prefer to try to missile delicate social and political problems out of existence, rather than address the problems and thus infringe on power and privilege. The bombing in Jeddah after the Iraq War fits the pattern of earlier actions. The target was the civilian compound of Vinyl Corporation, a subsidiary of Northrop Grumman, which provides retired U.S. military officers to train the elite armed forces that protect the royal family, not from foreign invasion. A Vinyl training facility had been bombed in 1995. The bombing makes the point that you are going after aspects of the military presence in Saudi Arabia. A British risk analyst observed, the military contractors who play a very important supporting role. Michael Ignatieff, who advocates a U.S. imperial role in the Middle East, reflects a broad consensus in writing that the larger challenge for the U.S. and the chief danger in the whole Iraqi gamble is to enforce a peace on the Palestinians and Israelis. The U.S. enforced peace must, as a minimum, give the Palestinians a viable, contiguous state and rebuild their shattered infrastructure. To leave the Palestinians to face Israeli tanks and helicopter gunships is a virtual guarantee of unending Islamic wrath against the United States. Ignatieff writes that Americans have played imperial guarantor since the 1940s, but he does not explain what the U.S. has guaranteed since it assumed the mantle. He also overlooks the fact that Israeli gunships are U.S. gunships with Israeli pilots, and that the tanks would not be able to do their work without U.S. largesse. Also unexamined is why the U.S. should be expected to reverse so dramatically the policy of unilateral rejectionism tracing back over 30 years. Putting these and other not inconsequential matters aside, his perception has considerable plausibility. Those who have an interest in mitigating rather than enhancing terror, to borrow again the president's words, might do well to attend to the advice of those with the most experience in confronting it. None have more experience than Israel's General Security Service, Shabak, responsible for counterterror in the occupied territories. The head of Shabak from 1996 to 2000, Ami Ayalon, observed that those who want victory against terror without addressing underlying grievances want an unending war, much as President Bush proclaimed. The former head of Israeli military intelligence, 1991 to 1995, Yuri Seiji, draws similar conclusions. As the Lebanon invasion and other military actions illustrate, he wrote, Israel will get nowhere by following the slogan, "We will teach you what is good for you," by our superior force. We must see things from the perspective of the other side. Those who hope for mutual survival with the Arabs must accept a minimum of respect for Arab society. The alternative is unending war. Ayalon and Seiji are speaking of Israel-Palestine, where the solution to the problem of terrorism is to offer an honorable solution to the Palestinians respecting their right to self-determination. So Yehoshaphat Harkabi, former head of Israel military intelligence and a leading Arabist, observed 20 years ago, at a time when Israel still retained its substantial immunity from retaliation from within the occupied territories. The observations generalize in familiar ways. Northern Ireland, to mention one case, is far from a paradise but vastly improved over the days when Britain ignored legitimate grievances in favor of force. The specific policies that inflamed the potential support base for Islamic terrorism were Israel-Palestine and the murderous US-UK sanctions regime in Iraq. But long before, there were more fundamental issues. Again, it makes little sense to ignore these, at least for those who hope to reduce the likelihood of further terrorist crimes or to answer George W. Bush's plaintive question, "Why do they hate us?" The question is wrongly put. They do not hate us, but rather the policies of our government, something quite different. If the question is properly formulated, answers to it are not hard to find. In the critical year 1958, President Eisenhower and his staff discussed what he called the campaign of hatred against us in the Arab world, not by the governments but by the people. The basic reason, the National Security Council advised, was the perception that the U.S. supports corrupt and brutal governments and is opposing political or economic progress in order to protect its interest in Near East oil. The Wall Street Journal and others found much the same when they investigated attitudes of westernized, moneyed Muslims after 9/11, bankers, professionals, managers of multinationals, and so on. They strongly support U.S. policies in general but are bitter about U.S. support for corrupt and repressive regimes that undermine democracy and development, and the more specific and recent issues concerning Israel-Palestine and Iraq sanctions. These are attitudes of people who like Americans and admire much about the United States, including its freedoms. What they hate are official policies that deny them the freedoms to which they too aspire. Attitudes in the slums and villages are probably similar, but harsher. Unlike the moneyed Muslims, the mass of the population have never agreed that the wealth of the region should be drained to the West and local collaborators, rather than serving domestic needs. Many commentators prefer more comforting answers. Anger in the Muslim world is rooted in resentment of our freedom and democracy, in their own cultural failings tracing back many centuries, in their alleged inability to take part in the form of globalization in which they, in fact, happily participate, and other such deficiencies. More comforting, perhaps, but not too wise. Little has changed since 9/11. Washington's increased support for the dictatorships of Central Asia is only one illustration, arousing deep hostility among democratic forces. Ahmed Rashid reports that in Pakistan as well, there is growing anger that U.S. support is allowing Musharraf's military regime to delay the promise of democracy. A well-known Egyptian academic traces hostility toward the U.S. to its support for every possible anti-democratic government in the Arab Islamic world. When we hear American officials speaking of freedom, democracy and such values, they make terms like these sound obscene. An Egyptian writer added that, living in a country with an atrocious human rights record that also happens to be strategically vital to U.S. interests, is an illuminating lesson in moral hypocrisy and political double standards. Terrorism, he said, is a reaction to the injustice in the region's domestic politics, inflicted in large part by the U.S. The director of the terrorism program at the Council of Foreign Relations agreed that backing repressive regimes like Egypt and Saudi Arabia is certainly a leading cause of anti-Americanism in the Arab world, but warned that in both cases the likely alternatives are even nastier. There is a long and illuminating history of the problems in supporting democratic forms, while ensuring that they will lead to preferred outcomes, not just in the Middle East. And it doesn't win many friends. Opinion surveys in early 2003 reveal that from Morocco to the Gulf Emirates, a huge majority said that, if given the choice, they would like their Islamic clergy to play roles bigger than the subservient ones currently prescribed by most Arab governments. Almost 95% dismissed the idea that the U.S. is committed to a more democratic Arab or Muslim world, believing instead that the war in Iraq was waged to ensure control of Arab oil and the subjugation of the Palestinians to Israel's will, and, overwhelming margins, expect terrorism to increase as a consequence of the invasion. Throughout the Arab and Muslim worlds, as far as Indonesia, Islamic fundamentalism is on the rise, appealing not only to the poor but increasingly to more privileged and educated sectors as well, while America's natural friends, who could provide liberal alternatives, share the deep mistrust of U.S. intentions and policies. Attitudes remain rooted in the same perceptions as half a century ago, for substantial reasons. George Bush is despised even by those who used to admire the U.S., Jonathan Steele reports from Jordan. Anger with Britain and America has grown, and Blair's promises of action to solve the Palestinian-Israeli conflict are not taken seriously. Even the most Western-oriented Jordanians believe that the war set democracy back across the Middle East and placed advocates of modernization and secular values on the defensive, and few doubt that yet more violence will emerge. A prominent Egyptian intellectual for whom the U.S. was a dream, a paragon of liberal values to be emulated by Arabs and Muslims, and who has devoted decades of his life to modernizing Islamic life and promoting understanding between Muslims and non-Muslims, regards the Bush administration as narrow-minded, pathological, obstinate, and simplistic. It is to blame for the fact that, to most people in this area, the United States is the source of evil on planet Earth, he says. Similar opinions can also be heard these days from wealthy Arab businessmen, university professors, senior government officials, and Western-leaning political analysts, very much as before, but now with far greater intensity and despair. If the voice of the people is allowed a hearing in the new Middle East, it might turn out to be the voice of radical Islamists calling for jihad, or of secular nationalists whose perceptions of history and current practice are not quite those of Anglo-American elites. What has been reviewed here is the barest sample of what we readily discover if we pay some attention to elementary fact, and agree to apply to ourselves the standards we impose on others. More follows if we are willing to enter the moral arena in a serious way, going beyond the merest truisms and recognizing the obligation to help suffering people as best we can, a responsibility that naturally accrues to privilege. It is not pleasant to speculate about the likely consequences if concentrated power continues on its present course, protected from the scrutiny that would be second nature if we were to take seriously the legacy of freedom we enjoy. Chapter 9. A Passing Nightmare? After 9/11, the country was peering into the abyss of the future. The awesome threat of terror, though clear enough since the attack on the World Trade Center in 1993, was now too palpable to ignore. To be more precise, it was the public that was peering into the abyss. Those at the center of power relentlessly pursue their own agendas, understanding that they can exploit the fears and anguish of the moment. They may even institute measures that deepen the abyss and may march resolutely toward it, if that advances the goals of power and privilege. They declare that it is unpatriotic and disruptive to question the workings of authority, but patriotic to institute harsh and regressive policies that benefit the wealthy, undermine social programs that serve the needs of the great majority, and subordinate a frightened population to increased state control. Literally before the dust had settled over the World Trade Center ruins, Paul Krugman reported, influential Republicans signaled that they were determined to use terrorism as an excuse to pursue a radical right-wing agenda. He and others have documented the relentless pursuit of that agenda. A natural reaction of concentrated power to any crisis, it was unusually ugly in this case. Other states perceived the same opportunity. Russia eagerly joined the coalition against terror, expecting to receive authorization for its atrocities in Chechnya, and was not disappointed. China happily joined for similar reasons. Israel recognized that it would be able to crush Palestinians even more brutally, with even firmer U.S. support. And so on, throughout much of the world. The threat of international terrorism is surely severe. The horrendous events of 9/11 had perhaps the most devastating instant human toll on record, outside of war. The word instant should not be overlooked. The crime is not otherwise unusual in the annals of violence that falls short of war, as understood very well by the traditional victims. The threat of terrorism is, however, not the only abyss into which we peer. A much more grave threat to biology's only experiment with higher intelligence is posed by weapons of mass destruction. In an important 1995 document, the U.S. Strategic Command, STRATCOM, described nuclear weapons as the most valuable in the arsenal, because, unlike chemical or biological weapons, the extreme destruction from a nuclear explosion is immediate, with few if any palliatives to reduce its effect. Furthermore, nuclear weapons always cast a shadow over any crisis or conflict, hence must be visible, at the ready. The study advises that planners should not portray themselves as too fully rational and cool-headed. That the U.S. may become irrational and vindictive if its vital interests are attacked should be a part of the national persona we project. It is beneficial for our strategic posture if some elements may appear to be potentially out of control. Clinton's Stratcom was proposing a version of Nixon's famous madman theory, which he and Kissinger applied in an October 1969 nuclear alert that they believed to be risk-free, but that might have gotten out of control because of critical factors they ignored. Yet another example of the unpredictable consequences of the threat or use of force, which in the current era can be very serious indeed. The U.S. must retain the right of first use of nuclear weapons, Stratcom advised further, even against non-nuclear powers that have signed the 1970 Nuclear Non-Proliferation Treaty, and must continue to maintain its launch-on warning posture for strategic nuclear missiles, on hair-trigger alert. It appears that the Clinton administration adopted these proposals. The U.S. is unusual, perhaps unique, in the access it allows to high-level planning documents, an important achievement of American democracy. This one, like others, has been available for years but is scarcely known, not a democratic triumph. Severe threats are not limited to the weapons of mass destruction in the hands of the powerful. Small nuclear weapons can be smuggled into any country with relative ease, along with other potentially very destructive varieties of WMD. The most immediate threat, a Department of Energy task force advised, is that there could be 40,000 nuclear weapons in the former Soviet Union, poorly controlled and poorly stored. One of the first acts of the Bush administration was to cut back a small program to assist Russia in safeguarding and dismantling these weapons and providing alternative employment for nuclear scientists, a decision that increases the risks of accidental launch, and also leakage of loose nukes, perhaps followed by nuclear scientists with no other way to employ their skills. Programs for missile defense are expected to enhance these threats. U.S. intelligence predicts that any American deployment will impel China to develop new nuclear-armed missiles, expanding its arsenal tenfold, probably with multiple warheads, MIRV, prompting India and Pakistan to respond with their own buildups, with a likely ripple effect to the Middle East. Intelligence officials also predict that Russia and China both would increase proliferation, including selling countermeasures for sure to such nations as North Korea, Iran, Iraq, and Syria. These and other analyses conclude further that Russia's only rational response to the national missile defense system would be to maintain and strengthen the existing Russian nuclear force. The Bush administration announced that it has no objections to China's plans to build up its small fleet of nuclear missiles, shifting policy in the hope of gaining Chinese acquiescence to the planned dismantling of core arms control agreements. For similar reasons, Clinton negotiators had encouraged Russia to adopt a launch-on-warning strategy, a proposal that nuclear experts regarded as pretty bizarre, because we know that Russia's deteriorating warning systems are full of holes and prone to false alerts, increasing the threat of Russian unauthorized, accidental, and erroneous launches. Chinese resumption of nuclear testing was also being quietly endorsed, it was reported. Strategic analysts pointed out that this change of policy would encourage China to aim more nuclear-armed missiles at the US and Japan, with the expected effect on Japanese and Taiwanese programs. At the same time, the press reported that the US would impose sanctions on China for allowing the transfer to Pakistan of missile parts and technology that are essentially for weapons that can carry nuclear warheads. All pretty bizarre, if security is a highly valued concern. Missile defense and other military programs of the Bush administration are inherently provocative to Russia and China, John Steinbrunner and Jeffrey Lewis point out. Like other strategic analysts, they describe the Strategic Offensive Reductions Treaty signed by Bush and Putin in May 2002 as mostly for show. It will not meaningfully diminish the lethal potential of either nation's nuclear force. Nor will it establish a stable strategic balance. The deteriorating Russian arsenal will become increasingly vulnerable to preemptive attack, particularly as the United States undertakes planned modernization of nuclear forces and the deployment of missile defenses, probably driving Russia to react in turn, as later reports indicate. China also recognizes U.S. programs to be a direct threat to its minimal deterrent force, and is likely to readjust priorities from economic development to defense. China was particularly alarmed. Steinbrunner and Lewis write, by a 1998 long-range planning document of the U.S. Space Command outlining a new concept of global engagement, including space-based strike capabilities that would allow the U.S. to attack any country and to deny similar capability to any other countries, another Clinton-era precursor to the National Security Strategy of September 2002. The UN Conference on Disarmament has been deadlocked since 1998 by China's insistence on maintaining the use of space for peaceful means and Washington's refusal to agree, alienating many allies and creating conditions for confrontation. A May 2003 Rand Corporation study concludes that the potential for an accidental or unauthorized nuclear missile launch in Russia or the United States has grown over the past decade, despite warmer U.S.-Russian relations. Neglecting these risks could produce possibly the greatest disaster in modern history, and possibly in world history, said former Senator Sam Nunn, co-chairman of the Nuclear Threat Initiative, which funded the report. The major threat derives from the thousands of nuclear warheads that each side maintains, with the U.S. increasing its nuclear capabilities, which will drive Russia to heightened alert status and probable implementation of a launch-on-warning approach to warfare requiring rapid reaction for launching some 3,000 warheads, sharply increasing the danger of nuclear destruction by accident. None, too, dismisses the Bush-Putin Treaty of 2002 as meaningless. Like the U.S., Russia responded to the treaty by rapidly increasing the scale and sophistication of its nuclear and other military systems, motivated in part by concerns about U.S. plans. The extent of the problem of grave proliferation risks from stockpiles of nuclear, biological, and chemical weapons was also revealed in a study issued by a consortium of influential research centers. It concludes that virtually none of Russia's plutonium and less than 1/7 of its highly enriched uranium has been rendered unusable for nuclear weapons, and the same is true for the United States. Moreover, thousands of weapons scientists and workers in Russia are still unemployed or underemployed, the report says, and susceptible to lucrative offers of work from countries that could have secret germ weapons programs. There has been some progress under the Nunlugar Cooperative Threat Reduction Program, but the tasks ahead remain daunting. As noted, the National Security Strategy of 2002 virtually ignored measures to alleviate the threat of military confrontation. No less disturbing, it invited potential adversaries to continue to seek deterrence through their own mass casualty weapons and novel means to deliver them, thus breeding proliferation. And all that it entails. Bush's budget proposals reflected the same priorities. Missile defense alone received more funding than the entire State Department, and 4 times as much as programs to safeguard dangerous weapons and materials in the former Soviet Union. Maintaining the U.S. nuclear arsenal and preparing for resumption of nuclear tests received almost 5 times as much funding as initiatives to control loose nukes and fissile materials. Even before the national security strategy was announced, Bush had called for programs for offensive use of nuclear arms. His Pentagon planners described both nuclear and non-nuclear weapons as offensive strike systems that can be a key pillar of a new triad of offensive, defensive and military industrial resources, providing new means to defeat opponents decisively. Traditional policy has been turned upside down, Ivo Dalder of Brookings observes, as nuclear weapons become a tool of warfighting rather than deterrence, also eroding the distinction between conventional weapons and WMD. Bush further proceeded to lower the nuclear threshold and break down the firewall separating nuclear weapons from everything else, as the U.S. prepared for the invasion of Iraq, making the world infinitely more dangerous than it was 2 years ago, when George W. Bush took the presidential oath of office, military analyst William Arkin wrote. In May 2003, Congress adopted the Bush administration programs, opening the door to a new generation of nuclear weapons, potentially touching off an arms race as other nations try to match American capability. The Senate Armed Services Committee repealed a 1993 ban on research and development of low-yield nuclear weapons. Though the technology is so advanced that others are unlikely to follow suit directly, the change in policy is nevertheless good news to nuclear states in Asia, an Indian disarmament expert comments unhappily, helping them claim that they can refine their weapons systems and the research also. Another adds that The policy of the US toward Iraq and North Korea only gives more incentive for nations to get nuclear weapons. If the US tests weapons, then China will test, and there will be domestic pressure for India to test as well. Then Pakistan, you're opening a can of worms. Defense analyst Harlan Ullman warned that a country that is specifically threatened, like Iran, might hurry its nuclear weapons program after seeing the United States lead an assault on Iraq, providing the pretext for an invasion of Iran, in a self-fulfilling prophecy. Others expect that Pakistan, feeling pushed into desperation by India and its significant superiority in conventional forces, would feel freer to use nuclear weapons in a first strike. Extension of the arms race to space has been a core program for some years. Race is a misleading term, because the US is competing alone, for the moment. Militarization of space, including such programs as ballistic missile defense, BMD, increases the danger of destruction for the US, as for others. But that is nothing new. History provides many examples of policy choices that increase security threats, consciously. More ominous is the fact that the choices make some sense within prevailing value systems. Both topics merit some thought. Consider a few crucial stages of the Cold War arms race. At mid-20th century, the main threat to U.S. security, then only a potential threat, was intercontinental ballistic missiles, ICBMs. Russia might have accepted a treaty banning these delivery systems, knowing that it was far behind. In his authoritative history of the arms race, McGeorge Bundy reports that he could find no record of any interest in pursuing this possibility. Recently released Russian archives yield some new understanding of these matters, though also leaving unresolved mysteries, the bitterly anti-communist Soviet scholar Adam Ulam observed. One such mystery is whether Stalin was serious in a March 1952 proposal that appeared to allow unification of Germany, as long as Germany did not join a military alliance directed against the Soviet Union, hardly an extreme condition a few years after Germany had, once again, virtually destroyed Russia. Washington wasted little effort in flatly rejecting Moscow's initiative, Ulam commented, on grounds that were embarrassingly unconvincing, leaving open the basic question: was Stalin genuinely ready to sacrifice the newly created German Democratic Republic, GDR, on the altar of real democracy, with consequences for world peace that could have been enormous? Recent archival research surprised many scholars, Melvin Leffler writes, by revealing that after Stalin's death, Lavrenti Beria, the sinister, brutal head of the secret police, Prapo, ed., that the Kremlin offer the West a deal on the unification and neutralization of Germany, apparently agreeing to sacrifice the East German communist regime to reduce East-West tensions and improve internal political and economic conditions in Russia. That such opportunities existed, and were squandered in favor of securing German participation in NATO, was strongly argued by the noted political analyst James Warburg Wright at the time, but the suggestion was ignored or ridiculed. The archives do, however, shed light on other Soviet proposals that were quickly rejected in favor of a risk-filled military buildup. They reveal that after Stalin's death, Khrushchev called for mutual reduction of offensive military forces and, when these initiatives were ignored by the Eisenhower administration, implemented them unilaterally over the objections of his own military command, in order to concentrate on economic growth. He believed that the U.S. was using the arms race to destroy the far weaker Soviet economy, hoping, by that means, to obtain its goals even without war. Kennedy planners knew of Khrushchev's additional unilateral steps to reduce Soviet offensive forces radically, and were well aware that the U.S. was far ahead by any meaningful measure. Nevertheless, they chose to reject Khrushchev's call for reciprocity, preferring to carry out a massive conventional and nuclear buildup, thus driving the last nail into the coffin of Khrushchev's agenda of restraining the Soviet military. Matthew Evangelista concludes, reviewing the archival records. Kenneth Waltz observes that the U.S., in the early 1960s, undertook the largest strategic and conventional peacetime military buildup the world has yet seen. Even as Khrushchev was trying at once to carry through a major reduction in conventional forces, and to follow a strategy of minimum deterrence, and we did so even though the balance of strategic weapons greatly favored the United States, predictably eliciting a Soviet reaction. Similar conclusions were drawn by the prominent strategic analysts Raymond Garthoff and William Kaufman, who observed these processes from inside U.S. intelligence and the Pentagon. The reaction of the Soviet military to the U.S. buildup, influenced also by the demonstration of Soviet weakness in the Cuban Missile Crisis, effectively terminated Khrushchev's reformist project. Had it proceeded, it might have averted the social and economic stagnation in Russia from the 1960s on, and expedited the desperately needed internal changes that Gorbachev tried to implement, though too late. It might also have prevented the human catastrophe of the 1990s, as well as the destruction of Afghanistan and many other atrocities, not to speak of the serious danger of nuclear disaster as the arms race reached even more threatening dimensions. Throughout history, aggressive and provocative measures have been justified in terms of defense against merciless foes. In Kennedy's case, defense against what he termed the monolithic and ruthless conspiracy dedicated to world conquest. That is another claim that carries little or no information, because it is so predictable, whatever the circumstances, whoever may be the source. To comprehend the underlying logic, it is well to recall a doctrinal truism. It is conventional for controversial initiatives, particularly when hazardous, to be called a defense. Current programs are no exception. Missile defense is only a small component of much more ambitious programs. For militarization of space, with the intent to achieve a monopoly on the use of space for offensive military purposes. The plans have been available in public documents of the U.S. Space Command and other government agencies for some years. The projects outlined have been under development with varying intensity since the Reagan administration proposed the Star Wars Strategic Defense Initiative programs. SDI appears to have been largely an effort to disarm BMD opponents, by then a huge international anti-nuclear popular movement, by stealing their language and cause, invoking the terms peace and disarmament, while proceeding to construct a more advanced offensive military system. The SDI program was in clear violation of the Anti-Ballistic Missile (ABM) treaty signed in 1972, according to Raymond Garthoff and others. The Reagan administration sought to suppress their objections. State Department legal advisor Judge Abraham Sofar even threatened legal action to block Garthoff from publishing his book on the topic, a book that, in Garthoff's words, refutes the flagrant efforts by Paul Nitze and other Reaganite enthusiasts for SDI to distort the historical record and undercut U.S. legal commitment. They were later to claim that SDI was instrumental in ending the Cold War by forcing the USSR into heavy defense spending, a claim that has little merit, according to Garthoff's well-informed account. A case can be made, however, that the Kennedy administration's rejection of opportunities for mutual reduction of armaments, and its general aggressiveness and arms buildup, may have had such an effect, at great cost and with the threat of far worse. Missile defense and related initiatives were expanded in the first months of the Bush administration. By 9/11, U.S. military expenditures already surpassed those of the next 15 nations combined, but the opportunity to exploit the fear and horror engendered by the terrorist crimes was too tempting to ignore, and military programs were sharply increased across the board, with little if any relation to terror. BMD is widely recognized to be a Trojan horse for the real issue, the coming weaponization of space, with highly destructive offensive weapons placed in or guided from space. BMD itself is an offensive weapon. That is understood by close allies, and also by potential adversaries. Canadian military planners advised their government that the goal of BMD is, arguably more in order to preserve U.S./NATO freedom of action than because U.S. really fears a North Korean or Iranian threat. China's top arms control official was revealing nothing new when he observed that, once the United States believes it has both a strong spear and a strong shield, it could lead them to conclude that nobody can harm the United States and they can harm anyone they like anywhere in the world. China is well aware that it is a target of the radical nationalists designing policy in Washington, and presumably the prime intended recipient of the message in the national security strategy, that no potential challenge to U.S. hegemony will be tolerated. Chinese authorities are also surely aware that the U.S. maintains the right of first use of nuclear weapons. And they know as well as U.S. military analysts that flights by U.S. EP-3 planes near China, such as the one shot down in early 2001, engendering a mini-crisis, are not just for passive surveillance. The aircraft also collect information used to develop nuclear war plans. China's interpretation of BMD is shared by U.S. strategic analysts, in virtually the same words. BMD is not simply a shield but an enabler of U.S. action, a Rand Corporation study observed. Others agree. BMD will facilitate the more effective application of U.S. military power abroad, Andrew Bacevich writes in The Conservative National Interest, by insulating the homeland from reprisal, albeit in a limited way. Missile defense will underwrite the capacity and willingness of the United States to shape the environment elsewhere. He cites approvingly the conclusion of Lawrence Kaplan in the liberal New Republic that missile defense isn't really meant to protect America. It's a tool for global dominance. In Kaplan's own words, missile defense is not about defense. It's about offense. And that's exactly why we need it. BMD will provide the U.S. with absolute freedom in using or threatening to use force in international relations, China's complaint, which Kaplan quotes approvingly. It will cement U.S. hegemony and make Americans masters of the world. The background assumption is the contemporary version of Wilsonian idealism, a doctrine taken to be so authoritative as to be virtually immune from challenge. America is the historical vanguard, and must therefore maintain its global dominance and military supremacy forever and without challenge, for the benefit of all. It also follows that the absolute freedom in using or threatening to use force, to be conferred on the U.S. by BMD, is a precious gift we offer to mankind. Who can fail to perceive the impeccable logic? It is well understood that BMD, even if technically feasible, must rely on satellite communication, and destroying satellites is far easier than shooting down missiles. Anti-satellite weapons, banned by treaties that the Bush administration is dismantling, are readily available even to lesser powers. This paradox of the BMD program has been prominently discussed. But there is a possible solution, at least in some imagined world. Advocates of BMD place their faith in full-spectrum dominance, such overwhelming control of space, and the world in general, that even the poor man's weapons will be of no use to an adversary. That requires offensive space-based capacities, including immensely destructive weapons, Death Stars as they are sometimes called, possibly nuclear-powered, ready for launch with computer-controlled reaction. Such weapons systems greatly increase the risk of vast slaughter and devastation, if only because of what are called in the trade normal accidents, the unpredictable accidents to which complex systems are subject. Plans dated a few weeks after the national security strategy was announced take space systems to be key to our nation's military effectiveness. The U.S. must proceed from control of space to ownership, which is to be permanent, in accord with the national security strategy. Ownership of space is to permit instant engagement anywhere in the world, so that attacks from space can be integrated into combat plans. A viable prompt global strike capability, whether nuclear or non-nuclear, will allow the U.S. to rapidly strike high payoff, difficult-to-defeat targets from standoff ranges, and to provide warfighting commanders the ability to rapidly deny, delay, deceive, disrupt, destroy, exploit and neutralize targets in hours/minutes rather than weeks/days, even when U.S. and allied forces have a limited forward presence. These plans had already been outlined in a May 2002 classified Pentagon planning document, partially leaked, which called for a strategy of forward deterrence, in which hypersonic missiles launched from space platforms would be able to carry out almost instant, unwarned attacks. Military analyst William Arkin comments that no target on the planet or in space would be immune to American attack. The United States could strike without warning whenever and wherever a threat was perceived, and it would be protected by missile defenses, as well as internal security measures. Hypersonic drones would monitor and disrupt targets. The new weapons systems would permit the U.S. to bomb selected enemies instantly from U.S. bases, assisted by a host of advanced intelligence systems, including surveillance systems with the ability to track, record and analyze the movement of every vehicle in a foreign city, leaving the world at the mercy of U.S. attack at will. Without warning or credible pretext, the operational significance of the term perceived threat. The plans have no remote historical parallel. Even more fanciful ideas are being explored by the Pentagon's Advanced Research Agency, DARPA, including technologies to interface brain and machine, leading eventually, it is hoped, to brain-to-brain communication. That may be the future of warfare, researchers argue, but meanwhile it follows DARPA's traditional commitment to advance R&D at the boundaries of understanding so as to create the basis for the economy of the future, under the cover of defense. The goals of militarization of space are far-reaching. The Space Command's Clinton-era brochure Vision for 2020 announced the primary goal prominently on the front cover, dominating the space dimension of military operations to protect U.S. interests and investment. This is presented as the next phase of the historic task of military forces. Armies were needed during the westward expansion of the continental United States, in self-defense. Nations also built navies, the Space Command continues, to protect and enhance their commercial interests. The next logical step is space forces to protect U.S. national interests, military and commercial, and investments, including missile defense, as well as space-based strike weapons, enabling the application of precision force from, to, and through space. U.S. Space Forces, however, will be unlike navies in earlier eras. This time there will be a sole hegemon. The British Navy could be countered by Germany, with consequences we need not discuss. But the U.S. will remain immune, except to the development of WMD by rogue elements, and the narrowly circumscribed category of terrorism that is permitted to enter the canon, their terrorism against us and our clients. The need for full-spectrum dominance will increase as a result of the globalization of the world economy, the Space Command explains. The reason is that globalization is expected to bring about a widening between haves and have-nots. Like the National Intelligence Council, military planners recognize that the widening economic divide, that they too anticipate, with its deepening economic stagnation, political instability, and cultural alienation, will lead to unrest and violence among the have-nots, much of it directed against the U.S. That provides a further rationale for expanding offensive military capacities into space. Monopolizing this domain of warfare, the U.S. must be ready to control disorder by using space systems and planning for precision strike from space, as a counter to the worldwide proliferation of WMD by unruly elements, a likely consequence of the recommended programs, just as the widening divide is an anticipated consequence of the preferred form of globalization. The Space Command could have usefully extended its analogy to the military forces of earlier years. These have played a prominent role in technological and industrial development throughout the modern era. That includes major advances in metallurgy, electronics, machine tools, and manufacturing processes, including the American system of mass production that astounded 19th-century competitors and set the stage for the automotive industry and other manufacturing achievements, based on many years of investment, R&D, and experience in weapons production within U.S. Army arsenals. There was a qualitative leap forward after World War II, this time primarily in the U.S., as the military provided a cover for creation of the core of the modern high-tech economy, computers and electronics. Generally, telecommunications and the Internet, automation, lasers, the commercial aviation industry, and much else, now extending to nanotechnology, biotechnology, neuroengineering, and other new frontiers. Economic historians have pointed out that the technical problems of naval armament a century ago were roughly comparable to manufacture of space vehicles, and the enormous impact on the civilian economy might be duplicated as well, enhanced by the space militarization projects. One effect of incorporating national security exemptions in the mislabeled free trade agreements is that the leading industrial societies, primarily the U.S., can maintain the state sector on which the economy substantially relies to socialize cost and risk while privatizing profit. Others understand this as well. Retreating from his earlier critical stance regarding BMD, German Chancellor Gerhard Schroeder observed that Germany has a vital economic interest in developing missile defense technology, and must be sure it is not excluded from technological and scientific work in the field. Participation in BMD programs is expected to strengthen the domestic industrial base generally in Europe. Similarly, the U.S. BMD organization advised Japanese officials in 1995 that theater missile defense is the last military business opportunity for this century. Japan is being drawn in not only to exploit its manufacturing expertise but also to deepen the commitment of the industrial world to the militarization of space, locking the programs in, to borrow a standard phrase of policymakers and analysts. Throughout history it has been recognized that such steps are dangerous. By now the danger has reached the level of a threat to human survival. But as observed earlier, it is rational to proceed nonetheless on the assumptions of the prevailing value system, which are deeply rooted in existing institutions. The basic principle is that hegemony is more important than survival. Hardly novel, the principle has been amply illustrated in the past half-century. For such reasons, the U.S. has refused to join the rest of the world in reaffirming and strengthening the Outer Space Treaty of 1967, to reserve space for peaceful purposes. The concern for such action, articulated in UN resolutions calling for prevention of an arms race in outer space, is motivated by widespread recognition that Washington intends to breach this barrier, so far maintained. The U.S. was joined in its abstention in 1999 by Israel, in 2000 by Micronesia as well. As noted earlier, immediately after it was learned that the world had barely been saved from a war that might have destroyed the Northern Hemisphere, the Bush administration effectively vetoed yet another international effort to prevent the militarization of space. For the same reasons, Washington blocked negotiations at the UN Conference on Disarmament during the sessions that opened in January 2001. Rejecting the call of Secretary-General Kofi Annan that member states overcome their lack of political will and work toward a comprehensive accord to bar militarization of space. The U.S. remains the only one of the 66 member states to oppose launching formal negotiations on outer space, Reuters reported in February. In June, China again called for banning of weapons in outer space, but the U.S. again blocked negotiations. Again, that makes good sense if hegemony, with its short-term benefits to elite interests, is ranked above survival in the scale of operative values, in accord with the historical standard for dominant states and other systems of concentrated power. Much the same can be said about the breakdown of efforts to ban chemical and biological weapons. That they pose significant threats is not seriously in doubt, but higher priorities stand in the way of banning them. In April 2001, arms control experts reported that international verification of the ban on chemical weapons would have to be sharply curtailed, because the United States and other key parties to the treaty, mentioning Russia, have not paid their way. A specialist at the Henry Stimson Center in Washington commented that the Clinton administration had made a mockery of the treaty by establishing a separate set of rules for the United States, with unilateral exemptions. The U.S. was the only country to insist on exemption from certain inspections and tests, when the Senate ratified the Chemical Weapons Convention in 1997. The Bush administration decided to withdraw from negotiations to institute verification measures for the 1972 Biological and Toxic Weapons Convention, effectively terminating them. The U.S. had previously worked to limit the scope of the visits by foreign inspectors in order to protect American pharmaceutical and biotechnology companies, which dominate the worldwide industry and are concerned with protecting their trade secrets. The Bush administration proceeded to reject any form of verification on the grounds that mechanisms would be ineffective and would simply raise the risk to legitimate United States activities, a position condemned as completely unacceptable by a senior European diplomat. Shortly after, Other likely motives surfaced beyond protecting U.S. corporate interests, when it was revealed that the U.S. has 3 clandestine defensive projects that mimic a complete bioweapons program, violating the spirit and perhaps the letter of the verification protocols that the U.S. later officially rejected. Even before, Washington had argued that access to American biodefense installations might reveal military secrets, which is the purpose of enforcement mechanisms. Bioweapons specialists express concerns that the U.S. may have rejected the bioweapons protocol because it is committed to continuing and expanding its secret programs, in violation of treaties, pointing out that Washington appears to have had no interest in developing a protocol acceptable to the pharmaceutical industry. Among the suspected plans is genetic engineering of vaccine-resistant anthrax, which the Russians may already have developed. The U.S. appears to have embarked on a largely classified study, across several agencies, of biotech applications for the development of new bioweapons, apparently ignoring treaties. Therefore, the rest of the world will be obliged to follow suit, perhaps sparking a global bioweapons arms race. Proliferation of these technologies would also dramatically increase the chances that terrorists would become capable of mass casualty attacks using chemical or bioweapons, a threat also discussed in the 2002 Hart-Rudman report on terrorist threats to the United States.